Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Noah had learned to live with the whispers long before Charlotte disappeared. They started when he was 8 years old. Soft murmurs at the edges of his hearing that his parents dismissed as an overactive imagination. By 16, he'd stopped mentioning them entirely. By 25, he'd developed elaborate coping mechanisms, white noise machines, prescribed anxiolytics, cognitive behavioral therapy worksheets that gathered dust in his nightstand drawer. None of it silenced the voices of the dead. He'd met Charlotte 3 years ago at a coffee shop in Asheville, North Carolina. She was sketching in a leather-bound journal, her fingers stained with charcoal, and when she looked up at him with those gray-green eyes, Noah felt something shift. For the first time in his life, the whispers quieted. Not completely, they never stopped completely, but they retreated to a manageable background hum, like tinnitus you could almost forget about. Charlotte became his anchor to the living world, the one person whose presence could drown out the constant murmuring of things that shouldn't exist. When she told him she'd gotten a job as a botanical researcher at the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, studying high-altitude wildflower populations, Noah had felt the old dread creeping back. The isolation worried him. The wilderness worried him. But Charlotte had been so excited, her enthusiasm infectious, and he'd helped her pack her field equipment with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She'd promised to call every 3 days. She'd kept that promise for 6 weeks. Then the call stopped. The Park Service had been initially dismissive when Noah drove 16 hours straight to the ranger station at the forest's eastern entrance. Missing persons cases in national parks were common, they explained with practiced patience. Hikers wandered off trail. Researchers got absorbed in their work and lost track of time. Cell service was unreliable in the backcountry. Give it another 48 hours, they suggested. She'd probably show up with a sheepish grin and stories about following a rare species into unexpected terrain. But Noah knew. The whispers had changed pitch 3 days before Charlotte's last call. They'd become urgent, almost frantic, a discordant chorus that made his teeth ache and his hands shake. Something had happened. Something was wrong. Standing in the ranger station now, watching a weathered man named Dale Martinez spread topographical maps across a scarred wooden table, Noah pressed his fingertips against his temples and tried to focus on the living world. The station smelled of coffee, pine resin, and old paper. Dale's radio crackled occasionally with routine check-ins from patrol units. Everything was normal, concrete, real. Except for the whispers, which were screaming. Charlotte was working in Sector 7, Dale said, tapping a region of the map colored in shades of green and brown. About 15 miles northwest of here. Remote area, rough terrain. She'd established a base camp near Ghost Creek. Yeah, I know the name isn't encouraging. And was doing day hikes to document flower populations at various elevations. He looked up at Noah with the careful expression people used when delivering bad news gently. We sent a team out yesterday when you first called. They found her camp. Noah's heart lurched. And? Camp was intact. Tent, equipment, field notes all there. Her truck was parked at the trailhead where it should be. But no Charlotte. Dale's jaw tightened. There were some unusual aspects to the scene. Things the team couldn't quite explain. That's why we're taking this more seriously now. We're organizing a comprehensive search and rescue operation, launching at first light tomorrow. Tomorrow? Noah heard his voice crack. Why not now? There's still daylight left. It's a 4-hour hike just to reach her camp, Mr. Whitmore. If we start now, we'd be searching in the dark, and that's how we end up with more missing people. Dale's tone was firm, but not unkind. I understand your urgency, but we do this right, we do this safe. You're welcome to join the operation tomorrow if you sign the liability waivers, Noah wanted to argue, to demand immediate action. But the whispers were rising to a fever pitch now, making it hard to think. He nodded stiffly and stepped outside, needing air, needing space, needing the voices to just shut up for one goddamn minute. The parking lot was empty except for his sedan and 2 Park Service vehicles. Beyond the station, the forest rose in dense walls of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, mountains shouldering into a sky going purple with dusk. Beautiful, imposing, indifferent to human suffering, and full of whispers. Noah closed his eyes and did what he'd spent years learning not to do. He listened. The voices came into focus like a radio dial finding its frequency. Most were fragments, meaningless syllables that had degraded over decades or centuries of repetition. But underneath the static, Noah heard something else. A rhythm, a pattern, almost like chanting. His eyes snapped open. Without conscious decision, his feet were moving, carrying him toward the tree line. The rational part of his brain, the part that had been strengthened by years of therapy and medication, screamed at him to stop. This was how people disappeared. This was how you became a statistic in a Park Service database. But the whispers were pulling him forward with an urgency he'd never felt before. And underneath their insistence, he could feel Charlotte. Not hear her exactly, but sense her presence somewhere in that vast green darkness calling to him. He was 20 feet into the trees when Dale's voice cut through the twilight. "Mr. Whitmore, where the hell do you think you're going?" Noah turned to find the ranger jogging toward him, hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. In the fading light, Dale's face was hard with professional concern and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. "I just needed some air," Noah lied, stepping back toward the clearing. "Sorry, I'm not thinking straight." Dale studied him for a long moment. "There's a motel about 6 miles south on Route 287, the Pine Ridge. Get some rest, be back here at 0600, and we'll find your friend. But do not under any circumstances go into those woods alone. You understand me?" Noah nodded, but as he walked back to his car, the whispers followed him like a cold wind. And for the first time since Charlotte disappeared, he heard words he could understand, repeated in a dozen spectral voices that raised the hair on his arms and neck. "She calls. She calls. She calls from the crossing." The Pine Ridge Motel was exactly as depressing as its name suggested, a sagging collection of cabins that probably hadn't been renovated since the 1970s, arranged in a semicircle around a gravel parking lot. Noah paid cash for a room and sat on the bed without bothering to turn on the lights, staring at his phone and willing Charlotte's number to appear on the screen. It didn't. Instead, he scrolled through their text history, reading her last messages from 6 days ago. Mundane things. A photo of a wildflower she couldn't identify. A complaint about her camp stove malfunctioning. A joke about the local ranger who kept stopping by to check if she needed anything. Which would be sweet if he wasn't clearly just lonely and bored. The messages of someone planning to come home, not someone preparing to vanish. The whispers had subsided to their usual background murmur, but Noah couldn't shake the phrase they'd spoken. "She calls from the crossing." What crossing? Ghost Creek? Some metaphorical boundary between life and death? He pulled out his laptop and connected to the motel's stuttering Wi-Fi, searching for information about the area where Charlotte had disappeared. The results were sparse. The Shoshone National Forest covered nearly 2.5 million acres, and Sector 7 was one of its most remote regions. But buried in the search results, Noah found a blog post from an amateur historian documenting forgotten tragedies of the American West. The entry about Ghost Creek was short. In 1887, a group of settlers attempting to cross the Wind River Range in late October became trapped by early snowstorms in the area now known as Ghost Creek. Of the 23 people who entered the mountains, only 2 survived. Rescued 3 months later in conditions described as physically impossible by their rescuers. Both survivors died within days, allegedly speaking in languages they couldn't have known, and claiming the dead had taught them the words. Local Shoshone tribes had long considered the area cursed, believing it to be a thin place where the boundary between worlds grew permeable during certain celestial alignments. The survivors' arrival coincided with the winter solstice. Noah's hands had gone cold. He checked the date on his phone. October 28th. The winter solstice was nearly 2 months away, but the blog post mentioned certain celestial alignments, plural. He spent the next hour falling down a research rabbit hole, discovering references to quarter days, cross-quarter days, and the liminal periods between seasons when, according to various folk traditions, the veil between the living and dead grew thin. Samhain, Halloween, the end of October. 3 days from now. Noah stood abruptly, the motel room suddenly feeling like a cage. The whispers were rising again, more insistent, and this time he heard Charlotte's voice among them. Not speaking words exactly, but calling to him in wordless anguish that made his chest constrict. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. If you're enjoying this descent into terror, follow for more authentic horror stories. Could you survive if the dead began calling your name? The trail to Sector 7 was clearly marked, but quickly deteriorated into something barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. Noah had grabbed a flashlight from his car and a topographical map from the ranger station's unattended visitor center. Technically theft, but he'd left $20 on the counter, and was now 2 hours into what Dale had described as a 4-hour hike. Alone. In the dark. In potentially the stupidest decision of his life. But the whispers were guiding him, and for once, Noah trusted them. They'd never led him toward danger before. Usually they just tormented him with their existence. But now they felt purposeful, directional. Charlotte was out here. He knew it the way you know your own name. The forest at night was a different world. His flashlight beam carved a small tunnel of visibility through absolute darkness, catching the reflective eyes of nocturnal animals and making shadows dance between the trees. The temperature had dropped below freezing, his breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. Every sound was amplified. The crunch of pine needles under his boots, the distant scream of an elk, the rustle of something moving parallel to his path through the underbrush. Noah tried not to think about mountain lions, or bears, or the fact that he was violating every basic wilderness safety rule that existed. Around midnight, he reached Ghost Creek. The sound hit him first, water moving fast over rocks, the perpetual white noise of a mountain stream. His flashlight found the creek about 15 feet below the trail, cutting through a narrow gorge. According to his map, Charlotte's base camp should be another mile upstream. That's when Noah saw the symbols. They were carved into the bark of trees on both sides of the trail, deep gouges that had healed into dark scars. Not random vandalism. These were deliberate, repeated patterns. Circles with crosses inside them, spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward, figures that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. The symbols formed a line leading deeper into the forest, away from the established trail. Noah recognized some of them. Years of trying to understand his own condition had led him down strange research paths, and he'd encountered these marks in books about folk magic and protection wards. The circle cross was a crossroads symbol, used in necromantic rituals to mark places where the dead could be called. The spirals were meant to trap spirits, to bind them in place. Someone had marked this entire area for ritual purposes. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the flashlight. The whispers had reached a crescendo. Dozens of voices speaking over each other in a linguistic chaos that resolved, finally, into words. The crossing feeds. The crossing grows. Bones speak the words. Blood opens the door. "Charlotte!" Noah's shout echoed through the trees, swallowed quickly by the dense forest. "Charlotte, can you hear me?" Nothing. Just the creek and the wind and the whispers. He followed the symbols. What else could he do? They led him away from Ghost Creek up a steep incline where he had to grab at tree branches to pull himself forward, his city-soft hands already blistering. The forest grew denser here, the undergrowth thick with deadfall and brambles that caught at his clothes. His flashlight revealed more symbols, these ones painted on rocks and logs with something dark that might have been pitch or might have been dried blood. After 30 minutes of brutal hiking, the trees opened abruptly into a clearing. Charlotte's base camp was there, exactly as Dale had described. A 2-person tent, a camping stove, plastic totes containing field equipment and supplies. Everything neat and organized, as if Charlotte had simply stepped away for a few minutes and would return at any moment. But she wouldn't. Noah knew that now. Because in the center of the clearing someone had built a structure. It was crude, but deliberate. logs arranged in a circle about 12 feet in diameter, standing upright like a wooden fence. More symbols covered every surface, painted and carved and burned into the wood. Inside the circle, the earth had been excavated to a depth of several feet, creating a pit. And at the bottom of that pit, Noah's flashlight beam caught something pale and angular. He stepped closer, his breath coming in short gasps, and looked down. Bones. Human bones, arranged in careful patterns. Skulls placed at cardinal points, rib cages nested like baskets, long bones laid out in geometric configurations, the remains of multiple people, their identities long since reduced to anonymous calcium and decay. And scattered among the bones, objects, a rusted pocket watch, rotted leather boots, a tarnished belt buckle with a date stamp, 1887. The settlers, the ones who died during the winter crossing. Someone had found their remains and brought them here, arranged them for a purpose that made Noah's stomach turn. This was a ritual site, an active one, and on the far side of the clearing, tied to a tree with climbing rope, was Charlotte. Noah ran to her, dropping the flashlight, his hands fumbling with the knots that bound her wrists. "Charlotte, Charlotte, wake up." She was unconscious but breathing, her skin cold but not hypothermic. Relief flooded through him. She was alive. She was alive. He'd found her in time. Her eyes opened. For one horrible moment, Noah thought he was looking at a stranger. Charlotte's eyes had always been gray-green, the color of sage leaves, but the eyes staring at him now were completely black, as if her pupils had expanded to consume the iris and sclera entirely. And behind those black eyes, Noah's sensitivity picked up something else. Multiple presences, crowding, fighting for space. Charlotte's mouth opened, and a voice that wasn't hers said, in perfect Latin, "Mortui viventes vocant, ianua patet, tempus est." The dead call the living. The door is open. It is time. Noah stumbled backward, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possession like in the movies, theatrical and obvious. This was worse. Something subtle and wrong, like watching a puppet whose strings were being pulled by multiple handlers at once. Charlotte's body moved in small, jerking motions, her head tilting at angles that made his neck hurt in sympathy. "What did you do to her?" Noah shouted into the darkness beyond the clearing. "What the fuck did you do?" Movement in the trees. Not one person but many, emerging from the shadows like they'd been standing there all along, waiting. Noah counted 7 figures dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved in synchronized silence, forming a semicircle around the bone pit. The figure in the center pulled back her hood, revealing a woman in her 60s with white hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp, almost feverish. In her hands she held a book, its leather cover cracked and stained with age. "You must be Noah," she said, her voice carrying clear authority. "Charlotte told us about you, about your gift. We'd hoped you might find your way here on your own." "Let her go." Noah tried to sound commanding, but his voice shook. "Whatever you're doing, whatever this is, let her go and I won't tell anyone." "You can hear them, can't you?" The woman interrupted, stepping closer. "The dead. You've heard them your entire life. Such a rare gift in the modern world. In earlier times, you would have been valued, trained, perhaps even made a psychopomp, a guide for souls crossing between worlds." She smiled, and it was the gentle smile of a teacher addressing a slow student. "Instead, you've been medicated and told you're ill. What a waste." Noah's hands clenched. "Who are you?" "My name is Judith Crane. I'm a practitioner of the arte necromantia, what your psychiatrists would dismiss as delusion, but which is, in fact, the oldest and most potent form of magic, the magic of death and resurrection." She held up the book. "This is the Clavicula Salomonis Regis, the Key of Solomon, or rather, a very specific section of it dealing with the conjuration and binding of the dead. It's taken me 40 years to collect the necessary components for this working, 40 years of studying the old texts, identifying the proper location, waiting for the correct celestial alignment. She gestured to the bone pit. These are the anchors, the 21 souls who died at this crossing in 1887. They've been trapped here ever since, unable to move on, hungry for the life they lost. With the proper ritual, their hunger can be directed, shaped, used to thin the boundary between worlds and allow the dead to return to the flesh. Noah felt like he was going to vomit. That's insane. You can't just resurrect people. Can't we? Judith's smile widened. Watch. She opened the book and began to read. Not in English, but in a language Noah didn't recognize. Guttural and harsh, full of glottal stops and sounds that made his ears ring. The other hooded figures joined in, their voices creating a discordant harmony that seemed to resonate in Noah's chest cavity. The whispers exploded into screaming. Noah collapsed to his knees, hands pressed against his ears, but it didn't help. The voices of the dead weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head, shrieking in triumph and rage and terrible hunger. He could feel them battering against the walls of reality, pressing against the thin barrier that separated the living from the dead. And that barrier was tearing. In the bone pit, something was moving. The bones were shifting, crawling across each other like insects, pulled by invisible strings toward the center of the circle. They were assembling themselves, femurs connecting to hips, vertebrae stacking into spines, rib cages expanding like opening flowers. But they weren't forming complete skeletons. Instead, they were merging, creating something composite and wrong, a chimera built from 21 different people's remains. And as the bones assembled, pale tissue began to manifest around them, not growing, materializing like watching a photograph develop in reverse. Gray skin spreading over white bone, translucent at first but gaining opacity. Muscle fibers weaving themselves into bundles, organs blooming inside the chest cavity like grotesque fruit. Noah watched in paralyzed horror as the dead returned to flesh. The thing that rose from the pit was humanoid but fundamentally wrong. It had too many joints, too many teeth, eyes that were just hollows filled with cold light. It moved like a spider, all articulated limbs and predatory grace, and when it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was the voices of 21 people screaming in unison. Judith was laughing, tears streaming down her face. It works. After all these years, it actually works. The composite creature's attention fixed on Charlotte, still bound to the tree, and Noah understood. This was the first stage. The bones had been given flesh, but that flesh was dead tissue, animated but not truly alive. The ritual required one final component, a living host. Noah surged to his feet and ran to Charlotte, putting himself between her and the creature. His sensitivity was overloading, showing him things his brain couldn't process. The overlapping presences inside Charlotte's body, each one fighting for dominance. He could see their faces, translucent and desperate, the 21 settlers trying to claw their way into life through her. "Please," he said to Judith, to the hooded figures, to anyone who might listen. "She has nothing to do with this. Take me instead. I'm sensitive to the dead. Wouldn't I be a better vessel?" Judith shook her head sadly. "The vessel must be prepared, opened. Charlotte has been receiving the dead for 3 days now, acclimating her body to multiple presences. Her neural pathways have been restructured, her autonomic functions subordinated to external control. You couldn't survive the transfer. You'd burn out like an overloaded circuit." The composite creature was moving closer, drawn to Charlotte like a magnet. Noah could see the individual bones moving under its translucent skin, grinding against each other with sounds like cracking ice. He didn't think. He just acted. Noah grabbed a heavy branch from the pile of deadfall near the tent and swung it with all his strength at the nearest hooded figure. The branch connected with a satisfying crack and the figure went down. Before the others could react, Noah grabbed Charlotte, still bound, still possessed, her black eyes staring at nothing, and threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Then he ran. Behind him, Judith was shouting commands. The composite creature was moving, faster than something assembled from old bones should be able to move. Noah crashed through the forest in blind panic, Charlotte's weight making him stumble, branches whipping his face. His flashlight was back in the clearing, but his eyes had adjusted enough to navigate by moonlight, filtering through the canopy. The whispers were a solid wall of sound now, every dead thing in these mountains shrieking at him in fury. He could feel the forest itself turning hostile, roots reaching for his ankles, branches grabbing at his clothes. The boundary between worlds had been weakened and everything was bleeding together. Noah ran until his lungs burned and his legs turned to rubber, until he had no idea where he was or which direction led to safety. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, and then he collapsed in a tangle of roots at the base of an enormous pine tree, Charlotte still across his shoulder. They were in a small hollow, partially hidden by undergrowth. Noah set Charlotte down as gently as his shaking arms allowed and checked her vitals. Still breathing, still unconscious, still possessed by 21 desperate ghosts. He had no plan, no idea what to do next. He was lost in millions of acres of wilderness with a possessed woman and a cult of necromancers hunting them, and the dead were screaming so loudly inside his head he couldn't think. Then Charlotte's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with impossible strength. Her black eyes opened and focused on him with terrible clarity. When she spoke, it was with 21 voices layered over each other, creating a sound like a church choir from hell. Help us. Please help us. We never wanted this. We've been trapped so long, so hungry. Just want to be warm again. Want to feel anything again. Please. The voices dissolved into incomprehensible wailing, and Noah realized the awful truth. The settlers weren't evil. They were victims, trapped at the moment of their death, unable to move on, slowly going mad from isolation and hunger. Judith's ritual was offering them a way back to life, and they were desperate enough to take it regardless of the cost. They weren't monsters. They were just afraid, and that somehow made it worse. Noah looked into Charlotte's black eyes and spoke directly to the presences inside her. I can hear you. I've heard you my whole life. And I'm telling you, this isn't the way. Possessing Charlotte, using her body as a vessel, that's not life. That's just another form of prison. The voices quieted slightly, as if listening. There's a reason you haven't moved on, Noah continued, the words coming from some deep intuitive place. You're anchored to this place by trauma and fear. But the ritual Judith is performing, it's not freeing you. It's binding you to this world permanently, turning you into something twisted, neither dead nor alive, just trapped in a different way. Charlotte's mouth moved silently for a moment, and then one voice separated from the others, older, male, with a thick accent. What choice do we have? We cannot rest, cannot find peace. At least this promises sensation, however wrong. I can help you cross over properly, Noah said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. That's what my sensitivity is for. I'm a bridge between the worlds. I've been fighting it my whole life, but maybe this is what I'm supposed to do, guide lost souls home. You would do this? For strangers? For Charlotte? And because nobody deserves to be trapped like you've been trapped. The presences inside Charlotte seemed to confer with each other, the voices rising and falling in rapid conversation. Finally, the male voice spoke again. The necromancer will not allow it. She needs us for her working. She'll kill you both. Let me worry about that. Just, when I start the crossing ritual, you have to let Charlotte go, all of you, completely. Can you do that? A long pause. Then quietly. We will try. Noah pulled out his phone, grateful he'd had the paranoia to download offline maps before entering the forest. His GPS was still functional, and according to the map, they were about 3 miles from the ranger station. If he could get Charlotte there, get her to safety. A stick snapped in the darkness behind him. Noah spun around to find the composite creature standing at the edge of the hollow, its translucent flesh glowing faintly in the moonlight. This close, he could see the individual faces pressed against the inside of its skin, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. It was, he realized, a prison of its own, all the rage and hunger of the trapped dead given physical form. The creature reached for Charlotte with hands that had too many fingers. Noah did the only thing he could think of. He opened himself completely to the whispers. For 25 years, he'd fought his sensitivity, tried to mute it, medicate it, ignore it. Now he dropped every barrier and wall, letting the voices flood in without resistance. The sensation was overwhelming. Thousands of dead things crying out simultaneously, their grief and rage and loneliness pouring into him like water through a broken dam. But underneath the chaos, Noah found something else. The natural order, the way things were supposed to work. Life flows to death, death flows to whatever comes next. It was a cycle, a current, and the settlers had been dammed up in the middle of it for over a century. Noah spoke words he didn't consciously know, in languages that had never been taught to him. The phrases came from deep genetic memory, from the part of human consciousness that had been dealing with death since the first hominid buried their dead with flowers and grave goods. He spoke in Aramaic and Sumerian and tongues that predated writing, calling on the old names, the psychopomp deities who guided souls across boundaries. Anubis, Karen, Yama, Azrael, Zolotl, the Morrigan. I call upon the ferrymen, the guides, the shepherds of the dead. These souls are lost. Show them the way home. The air between worlds grew thin as tissue paper. Noah could see through it now, see the vast gray shore that waited on the other side, the river of souls flowing endlessly into mystery. And standing on that shore waiting with infinite patience were figures in dark robes, the psychopomps, the guides who had always been there, waiting to help the dead move on. Charlotte's body convulsed. Her black eyes rolled back, and one by one the presences inside her began to separate, becoming visible as translucent human forms. The 21 settlers appearing now as they had in life, men and women in rough frontier clothing, their faces gaunt with hunger and cold. They looked at Noah with expressions of desperate hope. "Go," Noah whispered. "You're free now. Go home." They went. One by one, the settler ghosts turned and walked toward the figures on the shore, passing through the thin boundary between worlds like walking through a waterfall. The male voice Noah had spoken with paused to look back. "Thank you, Bridgewalker. May you find peace as well." Then they were gone, and Charlotte gasped, color returning to her eyes as they shifted from black to her natural gray-green. "Noah? What? Where am I?" The composite creature let out a sound of pure anguish. Without the settlers' spirits to animate it, the dead flesh began to collapse, bones separating and clattering to the ground. Within seconds it had dissolved back into component parts, just old bones scattered across the forest floor. "We need to move," Noah said, helping Charlotte to her feet. "Can you walk?" She nodded shakily. "I remember people. They drugged me, tied me up. I could hear voices inside my head, feel things that weren't me trying to move my body. Noah, what the fuck happened?" "I'll explain everything when we're safe. Right now we need to. You ruined it." Judith Crane stood at the edge of the hollow, the Clavicula Salomonis Regis still in her hands. The other hooded figures emerged from the trees behind her, forming a semicircle. 40 years of preparation, decades of research. You just destroyed it with your naive meddling. Noah positioned himself in front of Charlotte. "It's over. The settlers have moved on. Your ritual failed." "This ritual failed," Judith corrected. "But there are others, different sources, different anchors." Her eyes fixed on Noah with terrible intensity. "And now I know what I was missing. A true psychopomp. Someone who can actually see and communicate with the dead, who can thin the boundary between worlds." She gestured, and the hooded figures moved forward. "We're going to start again, and this time you're going to help us, Noah Whitmore, willingly or otherwise." Noah felt Charlotte's hand grip his arm. The whispers were building again, but differently now. Not chaotic, but focused. United. He'd helped 21 souls cross over, and they hadn't forgotten. On the shore between worlds, the psychopomp figures were watching, waiting to see if he needed help. And deep in his sensitivity, Noah heard new voices. Not the settlers, but other dead, from throughout these mountains. Hikers who'd gotten lost. hunters who'd had accidents. All the souls that had accumulated in this place over decades, drawn to the thin spot, but unable to cross without help. They were angry about what Judith was trying to do, and they were numerous. "I don't think the dead appreciate being used as tools in your rituals," Noah said quietly. "You've been disturbing them for 40 years, binding them, trying to trap them in flesh against their will. They're not happy about that." Judith frowned. "They're dead. They don't get opinions." The forest around them exploded with paranormal activity. Trees groaned and cracked. The temperature plummeted. Frost formed on leaves and bark in seconds, and the air filled with shapes, translucent, angry, reaching. The hooded figures broke formation, some running, others falling to their knees in prayer. Judith stood her ground, shouting phrases from her grimoire, trying to bind the dead with ritual words. But there were too many, and they'd been freed from whatever constraints she'd put on them. Noah grabbed Charlotte's hand. "Run, now." They ran through a forest filled with ghosts, the dead parting before them like a courtesy, showing them the way. Noah's sensitivity let him see the path they created, illuminated by the faint glow of spirit energy. Behind them, Judith's screams cut off abruptly, and Noah didn't let himself think about what that meant. They reached the ranger station just as dawn broke over the mountains, stumbling out of the tree line and collapsing on the steps. Dale Martinez emerged moments later, already dressed and preparing for the day's search and rescue operation. "Jesus Christ," he said, dropping to his knees beside them. "Mr. Whitmore? Charlotte? What the hell happened out there?" Noah opened his mouth to explain and found he couldn't. Where would he even start? How could he describe what they'd experienced in a way that wouldn't get them both committed to a psychiatric facility? Charlotte saved him. "There were people. A group. They ambushed me at my camp, drugged me. I think they were, I don't know, some kind of cult? Noah found me and helped me escape." It was close enough to the truth. The authorities would find the ritual site, the bone pit, the symbols. They'd find Judith and her followers, or what remained of them. Let the investigators come up with their own explanations. Noah had learned long ago that the truth wasn't something most people wanted to hear. Over the following weeks, as the investigation unfolded and Charlotte recovered, Noah found that something fundamental had changed. The whispers hadn't stopped. They never would. But they'd become manageable, purposeful. Instead of a constant source of torment, they were now something he could direct, could use. His curse had become a calling. He helped 7 more souls cross over in the month after Charlotte's rescue. A hiker who'd fallen to his death in 2003, a ranger who'd had a heart attack on patrol in 1978, a child who'd wandered away from her family's campsite in 1952. Each one found through his sensitivity, each one guided to the shore where the patient psychopomps waited. Charlotte moved back to North Carolina. She didn't break up with him, not officially, but the distance between them was about more than geography. What she'd experienced in that forest, the feeling of being a passenger in her own body, had left scars that therapy was only beginning to address. She needed normal, safe, and Noah wasn't that anymore. He stayed in Wyoming, renting a small cabin near the Shoshone National Forest. The Park Service had offered him a job as a liaison to families of missing persons. Valuing his intuition about where to search, he accepted. It let him do what he was meant to do, help the lost find their way home. On cold nights when the wind howled through the pines and the whispers grew loud, Noah would sometimes think about Judith's grimoire. The authorities had never found it. She'd had it with her when the ghosts took her, and it had vanished along with her body. Sometimes he wondered if someone else would find it, would try to pick up where she left off. But then he'd feel the presence of the psychopomps standing guard on the shore between worlds, and he'd remember. The dead had their own protectors now. Guardians who understood that death wasn't meant to be escaped or conquered, just acknowledged and respected as part of the endless cycle. And somewhere in that knowledge, Noah finally found something approaching peace. The whispers would never stop. But for the first time in his life, he was okay with that. Hope you felt real chills reading about Noah's descent into necromantic horror. If you appreciate authentic folklore-based terror that explores the boundary between life and death, consider following for more supernatural stories. Which moment scared you most? The bone pit, the composite creature, or the possession? Joshua Garrett had broken up bar fights with his bare hands, pulled drowning swimmers from riptides, and once talked down a meth head wielding a broken bottle outside a convenience store in Flagstaff. Fear wasn't something he entertained. At 6'3" and 230 pounds of muscle earned through 20 years of search and rescue work, he'd learned early that projecting confidence and strength could resolve most situations before they escalated. The rest could be handled with his fists if necessary. But standing at the trailhead of Whisper Creek in the Olympic National Forest on a gray October morning in 2019, staring at Melissa Chen's abandoned Honda Civic, Joshua felt something unfamiliar coiling in his gut. Not fear, he wouldn't call it that. Concern, maybe. The wrongness of it all. Melissa had been missing for 3 days. The police had done their cursory search, declared it a voluntary disappearance, some bullshit about her recent divorce and needing space, and moved on. Joshua knew better. He'd worked with Melissa for 5 years at Cascade Mountain Rescue. She was level-headed, meticulous, the kind of person who triple-checked her gear and always filed detailed trip plans. She wouldn't just vanish into the woods without telling anyone, especially not in October when the weather could turn lethal without warning. Her car sat in the gravel lot. Passenger window cracked open despite the forecast for rain, a violation of her nature. Joshua circled the vehicle, his boots crunching on wet leaves. The doors were locked, but through the windows, he could see her emergency kit still in the back seat, untouched, fully stocked. Her phone was gone, her wallet too, but her car keys dangled from the ignition. Who leaves their keys in the car? He pulled out his own phone, checked the signal. 1 bar, enough. He'd already notified the Park Service he'd be conducting an independent search, though they'd been less than enthusiastic. Budget cuts, they said. Limited resources. If the police weren't treating it as urgent, neither would they. Fine. He'd done solo extractions before. Joshua shouldered his pack, 70 pounds of rope, medical supplies, emergency shelter, 3 days of food, and water filtration. He'd mapped out a grid search pattern the night before, starting with the most popular trails and expanding outward. Melissa was an experienced hiker, but even experts made mistakes. Twisted ankle, sudden illness, disorientation. Any number of mundane emergencies could trap someone in the wilderness. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained path cutting through ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Morning mist clung to the undergrowth, muting the world to shades of gray and green. Joshua moved with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. Disturbed vegetation, anything anomalous. 2 miles in, he found her first marker. A red bandana tied to a low branch, exactly the kind of trail marker Melissa would leave. Relief flickered through him. She'd been conscious enough to mark her path. He documented it with his phone camera, noted the GPS coordinates, and continued. The second marker appeared half a mile later. Another red bandana, this one tied higher, almost 8 feet up on a cedar branch. Joshua frowned. Why so high? He'd need to practically jump to reach it. Melissa was 5'6". She couldn't have tied it there without climbing. And why would she waste energy on that? Unless she wasn't alone. Unless someone taller had tied it. The thought should have alarmed him more than it did. Instead, it sharpened his focus. If someone had taken Melissa, if this was a kidnapping or worse, then he was tracking a perpetrator now. Good. Joshua had dealt with bad actors before. He'd once chased down a domestic abuser who'd fled into the Cascades, tackled him at the edge of a ravine. Humans, no matter how dangerous, operated on understandable principles. They could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, overpowered. The trail narrowed as he progressed, the canopy thickening overhead until the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. His boots squelched through mud, and he noticed the path was less maintained here, roots jutting up like arthritic fingers. The Park Service map showed this area as unmaintained wilderness. Fewer than 50 hikers a year bothered to venture this deep. Why would Melissa come here? The third marker wasn't a bandana. Joshua almost missed it, his eyes trained on the ground for footprints, but a flash of red in his peripheral vision made him stop. There, carved into the trunk of a massive hemlock about chest height, was a symbol. Not carved, burned. The wood was blackened, the lines precise and deliberate. It looked like a circle with a cross inside, but the cross had extra horizontal lines, and the circle itself was broken at the cardinal points. Joshua pulled out his phone and photographed it, zooming in on the details. The burns were recent. He could still smell the faint acidity of scorched wood. Melissa wouldn't have done this. Defacing trees in a national forest was illegal, and she took leave no trace principles seriously. Someone else had marked this tree. But why? Joshua pressed forward, his unease growing. The forest had gone quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the whisper of wind through needles and his own breathing. He'd experienced quiet forest before, but this felt different. Expectant. Like the woods were holding their breath. A quarter mile further, he found the fourth marker. This one stopped him cold. Tied between two trees at head height was a length of rope. No, not rope. Joshua approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife on his belt. As he got closer, he realized it was braided hair. Human hair, dark and glossy, woven into an intricate cord about 6 feet long. It stretched between the trees like a macabre clothesline, and hanging from it at intervals were small objects, bones, feathers, what looked like dried flowers, and something else that made his stomach turn. Teeth. Human teeth, drilled through and threaded onto the hair like beads. "What the fuck?" Joshua muttered, his voice too loud in the oppressive silence. This wasn't a trail marker. This was something else entirely. Something wrong. He should turn back. Call the police. Get forensics out here. Let the professionals handle whatever sick shit this was. But Melissa was still out here somewhere, and every hour that passed decreased her chances of survival. Besides, Joshua had never turned back from anything in his life. He wasn't about to start now. He documented the hair rope with photos from multiple angles, careful not to touch it, then continued past. His hand stayed on his knife. The trail, if it could still be called that, descended into a shallow ravine. Water trickled somewhere nearby and the air grew noticeably colder. Joshua's breath misted in front of him. His internal compass told him he'd been hiking roughly northeast, deeper into the most remote section of the forest, miles from the nearest maintained trail or road. Then he saw the trees. A grove of about 20 birches, their white bark stark against the darker conifers, forming a rough circle around a small clearing. And on every single trunk, burned into the bark, were symbols. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. They covered the trees from ground level to 8 feet high, a chaotic tapestry of geometric shapes, spirals, angular characters that looked almost like letters but weren't from any alphabet Joshua recognized. In the center of the clearing sat a flat stone, roughly table height and 6 feet long. Dark stains discolored its surface. Joshua's rational mind cataloged possibilities. Paint, rust, tree sap. But his gut knew better. Blood. Old blood. Layers upon layers of it, soaked into the porous stone. He stepped into the clearing, every instinct screaming at him to turn around. And that's when he noticed the smell. Underneath the forest's usual musk of decomposition and earth was something else. Something sweet and rotten and chemical all at once. Incense, maybe, mixed with decay. Around the stone's perimeter, someone had arranged objects in a deliberate pattern. Candles in iron holders, bowls filled with what looked like ash, small figurines carved from wood or bone, and books. 3 of them, leather-bound and ancient-looking, splayed open on the ground as if someone had been reading them during a ritual. Joshua approached the nearest book carefully, crouching to examine it without touching. The pages were yellowed parchment, covered in handwritten text. Latin, he thought, though he'd only taken 2 years of it in high school. He could make out a few words. Sanguis, blood. Invocare, invoke. Demon, demon. His phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. No signal anymore, just a low battery warning. 20% left. He'd been hiking for 4 hours. A sound cut through the forest, distant but distinct. A voice. No, voices. Chanting. Joshua's muscles tensed, his body flooding with adrenaline. The tough guy instinct kicked in. Find the source, confront the threat, take control of the situation. He moved toward the sound, using the trees for cover, his footsteps silent despite his size. The chanting grew louder as he crept forward. Multiple voices, maybe 6 or 7, speaking in unison. The words were incomprehensible, guttural, and rhythmic, Latin again, or something older. The cadence reminded him of church hymns, but twisted, inverted. Through a gap in the trees, Joshua saw them. A group of figures in dark robes stood in another clearing, larger than the first. They formed a circle around a bonfire that burned despite the damp October air, flames reaching 15 feet high. The robed figures swayed as they chanted, their faces hidden by hoods, and in the center of their circle, tied to a wooden post, was Melissa. Relief and rage flooded Joshua simultaneously. She was alive. Unconscious or drugged, maybe. Her head lolled forward, dark hair obscuring her face. But alive. And these fuckers had her. Joshua had never considered himself a violent man, but he had no qualms about violence when it was necessary. This qualified. He counted the figures again. 7. He was bigger than any of them, and surprise was on his side. He could charge in, scatter them, cut Melissa free, and be back to the car before they regrouped. Simple. He started forward, knife in hand, but froze as the chanting suddenly stopped. One of the robed figures stepped forward, and when they spoke, the voice was female, clear and commanding. "We know you're there, Joshua Garrett. We've been expecting you." Ice flooded his veins. How did they know his name? "Come out," the woman continued. "You followed our markers perfectly. Such a strong, brave man walking willingly into the trap." Trap. The word echoed in his mind. The bandanas, the hair rope, the symbols. They weren't trail markers or territorial warnings. They were breadcrumbs, leading him exactly where they wanted him. But Joshua had never backed down from a fight even when he should have, especially when he shouldn't have. Fear could be used, channeled into action, converted to aggressive energy. He stepped out from behind the tree, knife visible, his face set in the hard mask that had intimidated dozens of threats before. "Let her go," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Now." The robed figures laughed, not nervous titters, but genuine, delighted laughter. The woman pulled back her hood. She was younger than Joshua expected, maybe 30, with sharp features and eyes so dark they looked black in the firelight. "Or what? You'll fight us? Hurt us? Kill us?" "If I have to." "Ah, yes. The unshakable Joshua Garrett. We've researched you thoroughly. 20 years in search and rescue. High school wrestling champion. Honorably discharged Marine. You've never met a problem you couldn't solve with strength and courage, have you?" Joshua's grip tightened on the knife. "Last chance. Let her go." "She's already gone, Joshua. The moment she walked into our sacred ground 3 days ago, her fate was sealed, just as yours was sealed the moment you followed." The woman's smile widened. "Tell me, do you believe in demons?" "I believe in crazy people." How refreshingly skeptical. "But you've seen the symbols, the preparations. Did you look at the books? The Clavicula Salomonis, the Lesser Key, the Grimoire of Honorius. Authentic texts, Joshua. Centuries old. They describe rituals that predate Christianity, that reach back to when humanity first learned to bargain with the powers beyond the veil." Joshua had no patience for occult bullshit. He'd dealt with cults before, delusional idiots playing dress-up in the woods. They were dangerous because they were unpredictable and often armed, not because their fairy tales were real. "I'm taking Melissa and leaving," he said, starting forward. "By all means, try." He'd covered half the distance to Melissa when the world lurched sideways. Not physically. The ground remained solid under his boots, but something fundamental shifted. The air pressure changed, like the moment before a thunderstorm, and a sound filled his ears. A low thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in his bones. Joshua stumbled, his inner ear screaming contradictory signals. The fire burned brighter, changing from orange to a sickly green-blue. The robed figures raised their arms and the chanting resumed, louder, faster, the words hammering at his skull. "Astaroth dux potentissimus exaudi nos, per sigillum tuum, per nomina tua secreta, per sanguinem datum, manifestare." The temperature plummeted. Joshua's breath came out in white clouds, and frost crept across the ground with impossible speed, spreading from the fire outward in crystalline patterns. The flames shouldn't be creating cold, his rational mind insisted. Fire doesn't work that way. This wasn't possible. But then, neither was what happened next. The space above the fire split open. Not metaphorically. Joshua watched, his knife hanging uselessly in his hand, as reality tore like fabric. The air simply parted, revealing something beyond. Darkness deeper than any he'd ever seen. A void that hurt to look at because human eyes weren't meant to perceive that kind of absence. And from that darkness, something began to emerge. Joshua had been trained to assess threats quickly. Size, weapons, numbers, intent. But how do you assess something that doesn't conform to the rules of physical existence? The thing, creature, entity, demon, his mind had no adequate word for it, defied coherent description. It was both there and not there, solid and smoke simultaneously. What his brain interpreted as a body was vaguely humanoid but wrong in every proportion, too tall and too thin, with joints that bent backward and limbs that multiplied and merged as it moved. Its head, if that swollen mass at the top could be called a head, had too many eyes, or maybe those were holes, or maybe they were both at once. But worse than seeing it was feeling it. Presence. Malevolence. Intelligence so vast and alien that Joshua's mind recoiled from attempting comprehension. This thing was ancient, powerful, and hungry in ways that had nothing to do with physical appetite. His knife clattered to the ground. His legs, which had carried him through brutal missions and terrifying rescues without faltering, began to shake. "Behold Astaroth, Grand Duke of Hell," the woman said, her voice ecstatic. "Behold and despair, Joshua Garrett. Your strength means nothing here." The entity's attention, and Joshua felt that attention like a physical weight, swept across the clearing, across the robed figures, and settled on him. In that moment, some barrier in his mind crumbled. Every memory of courage, every moment he'd faced danger without flinching, suddenly seemed like childish bravado. He wasn't brave, he'd just never encountered anything truly dangerous. Everything he'd faced before had been human scale, comprehensible. This was neither. This was beyond him, beyond anyone, beyond everything. "No," Joshua whispered, the word inadequate, meaningless. His hands were shaking now, his whole body trembling despite every ounce of discipline and training, screaming at him to stand firm. But how do you stand firm when the ground beneath reality itself has given way? The entity moved, flowed, really, toward Melissa's unconscious form. Its presence made the air shimmer like heat haze, and where it passed, the very forest seemed to recoil. Trees bent away despite no wind, and their needles blackened and dropped. "Wait," Joshua's voice cracked. "Take me instead, please. She doesn't deserve this." The woman laughed again. "Deserve? This isn't about desert. Astaroth requires a vessel, a body to anchor itself to this realm." Melissa volunteered, though she didn't know it. "She stumbled into our ritual circle 3 days ago, and the moment her blood touched our sacred stone, she became marked, claimed. She's a person, not a thing for you to use." And you're a man who thinks courage and muscle can solve any problem. How's that working for you, Joshua? It wasn't. For the first time in his adult life, Joshua felt completely, utterly helpless. He'd faced down armed men, natural disasters, impossible odds, and never once considered running. But every fiber of his being now screamed at him to flee, to get as far from this clearing as possible, to never look back. But Melissa was still here. That thought, small and desperate, anchored him. Melissa, his friend, his colleague, a human being who didn't deserve to be used as some meat puppet for an interdimensional horror. If he couldn't fight this thing, if his strength was meaningless, then maybe he could bargain. Negotiate. These cult psychos had summoned it, which meant they had some kind of control, didn't it? There has to be another way, Joshua said, hating the pleading tone in his voice but unable to stop it. Another vessel, another ritual, something. The woman tilted her head, considering. There is, actually. Astaroth does prefer willing vessels. They last longer, accommodate the transformation better. If someone were to volunteer, to offer themselves freely, it would actually be preferable to forcing compliance. Hope and horror warred in Joshua's chest. Fine, me. Take me instead. Are you certain? Because once you consent, once you speak the words of offering, there's no turning back. Your body will no longer be yours. Your consciousness will be pushed aside, buried in the depths of your own mind while Astaroth wears your flesh. You'll be aware, Joshua. You'll feel everything it does with your body, but you'll have no control. For years, maybe decades, until your body finally gives out. Is your friend really worth that? Every rational part of Joshua's mind screamed no. This was insane. These people were insane. The thing hovering above the fire couldn't be real. It had to be mass hallucination. Some kind of drug they'd pumped into the air. Anything but what his senses were telling him it was. But he looked at Melissa, slumped and helpless against the post, and knew he couldn't walk away. Not because he was brave. He'd never felt less brave in his life. Because leaving her meant living with that choice forever. And that was a different kind of hell than whatever this thing might inflict. Yes, he said, let her go and I'll volunteer. The woman's smile was radiant. Oh, Joshua, such nobility, such sacrifice, very well. She turned to the other robed figures. Release the girl, bind him to the post. Two of them moved toward Melissa, cutting her bonds. She slumped to the ground, still unconscious but breathing. They dragged her to the edge of the clearing, out of the ritual circle, and Joshua felt a rush of relief even as 4 more figures grabbed him. He could have fought, should have fought. But what was the point? He'd made his choice. They forced him to his knees in front of the fire, and he felt the searing heat on his face while his back stayed frozen from the unnatural cold. The entity, Astaroth, watched with those too many eyes, and Joshua could feel its satisfaction like oily smoke coating his skin. You must speak the words, the woman said, pressing a knife to his palm. She drew it across, opening a deep cut that welled with blood. Repeat after me. Ego Joshua Garrett offero corpus meum voluntariae. I offer my body willingly, Joshua translated automatically, his high school Latin coming back unbidden. Say it in Latin. Words have power, Joshua. Ancient power. His hand throbbed, blood dripping to the ground, soaking into the earth, into the ritual circle. Ego Joshua Garrett, offero corpus meum voluntariae. The air pressure doubled, tripled. Joshua gasped, his lungs straining. Sum navis tua, instrumentum tum, domicilium tum in hoc mundo. I am your vessel, your instrument, your home in this world. Sum navis tua, instrumentum tum, domicilium tum in hoc mundo. The entity moved closer. Reality warped around it like water around a stone. Per sanguinem et voluntatem te invito intrare. By blood and will, I invite you to enter. Per sanguinem et voluntatem te invito intrare. The thing that was Astaroth reached out with something that might have been a hand, might have been a tendril of living shadow. might have been the concept of touch given impossible form. It pressed against Joshua's chest, and he felt it sink through his skin like he was made of water. The pain was beyond description. Not physical pain, though his body screamed, but something deeper. The sensation of being invaded at the most fundamental level, of having something foreign and vast and wrong pushing into the space where his self resided. His consciousness recoiled, trying to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in his own body while something else moved in, claiming territory, establishing ownership. Joshua tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't obey. He tried to move, but his limbs belonged to something else now. He could only watch, a prisoner behind his own eyes, as his hands raised themselves without his permission, as his head turned, as his face split into a smile that had never belonged to him. "Excellent," the woman said, and she was speaking to him but not to him, to the thing inside him. "Welcome to the material world, Astaroth. Your vessel is strong. It should serve you well for many years." Joshua's mouth opened, and a voice that was his but also wasn't spoke. "This one has a powerful will. It resists. How delightful." No, Joshua thought with every ounce of determination he'd ever possessed. "Get out. Get out." The entity inside him laughed, and Joshua felt it echoing in his bones. "Oh, you sweet, brave fool. Did you think you could fight me from the inside? You offered yourself freely. There is no escape now." Joshua had never believed in demons or possession or any of the supernatural. He'd been wrong, and that wrongness was going to haunt what was left of his consciousness. For however many years this body lasted, trapped and helpless in a prison of his own flesh, forced to watch whatever horrors this thing committed with his hands. His last thought as his own consciousness was pushed down into a tiny, screaming corner of his mind was that maybe courage wasn't enough. Maybe some things were bigger than strength or bravery or determination. Maybe some fights couldn't be won. The robed figures helped the entity inhabiting Joshua's body to its feet. It flexed his fingers experimentally, rolled his shoulders, testing the limits of its new flesh. Then it turned those eyes, still Joshua's eyes, but with something ancient and malevolent looking out through them, toward where Melissa lay unconscious at the clearing's edge. "This one knows her," Astaroth said through Joshua's mouth. "There are memories here, affection, loyalty. How wonderfully complex human emotions are. I think I shall enjoy exploring them through action." "No." Joshua tried to scream, but he had no voice anymore, just awareness, just horror. The woman bowed low. "The world is yours to experience, great Astaroth. What would you have us do?" "Return to your lives. Resume your mundane existences. I will walk among the humans now, wearing this strong man's face, and I will do what I have dreamed of for centuries in my prison beyond the veil." The entity smiled Joshua's smile, but all wrong. "I will indulge." And it walked toward Melissa, and Joshua could only watch. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Joshua's place? The woman called the others to retrieve Melissa's body, carrying her back toward the trail. Astaroth, wearing Joshua's body like an ill-fitting suit, followed at a leisurely pace. It was learning to coordinate human limbs, occasionally stumbling over roots or misjudging distances. Each failure seemed to amuse it, deep in the trapped corner of his consciousness that remained. Joshua raged and pleaded and screamed without sound. His body kept walking. They emerged from the forest 2 hours later. The sun was setting, painting the parking lot in shades of blood red. Melissa had regained consciousness halfway back, groggy and confused, with no memory of the past 3 days. The cult members had fed her a story about her getting lost, hitting her head, and Joshua heroically tracking her down. They'd played concerned citizens, offering to drive her to the hospital for evaluation. She'd hugged him, hugged Astaroth wearing his skin, and thanked him for never giving up on her. The entity had returned the embrace, and Joshua felt his arms moving, felt the warmth of her against his chest, felt everything while being able to do nothing. "I knew you'd find me," Melissa said, tears in her eyes. "You're the bravest person I know, Josh." If he'd had access to his face, Joshua would have wept. The police were called, statements taken. Everyone praised Joshua's dedication and skill. The cult members melted away, their part finished, and Astaroth learned quickly, mimicking Joshua's speech patterns and mannerisms with increasing accuracy, making jokes, accepting gratitude, playing the role of hero with sardonic amusement. Only Joshua knew the truth. Only he felt the entity's anticipation for what came next. That night, alone in his apartment, the entity examined Joshua's life through his memories. It learned his routines, his relationships, his habits. It discovered that Joshua lived alone, convenient, and that his job gave him access to isolated areas and vulnerable people. Very convenient. "Such a perfect vessel you've given me," Astaroth said aloud, Joshua's voice echoing in the empty apartment. Strong, trusted, respected, and so deliciously ironic. The brave hero, now a prison for a demon. The man who never backed down, now powerless to stop me from using his body for whatever I desire. Joshua screamed without voice in his mental cage. Over the following days, the entity settled into its new existence with disturbing ease. It went to Joshua's job, performed search and rescue operations, saved lives, partly to maintain appearances, partly because it found human gratitude amusing. It dated Joshua's girlfriend, breaking her heart slowly and methodically for entertainment. It hurt people in subtle ways, psychological torments that left no physical evidence but created suffering nonetheless. And always, Joshua was aware, feeling everything, controlling nothing. A week after the possession, Astaroth took Joshua's body back to the forest, to the ritual site. The cult was gone, but evidence of their ceremony remained. The entity stood before the stone altar, and in the privacy of the wilderness, it finally spoke honestly. "I'm going to enjoy this existence for a very long time, Joshua. Your body is young and healthy. Decades, probably. And the beauty is that your consciousness will persist the entire time, trapped and helpless, forced to witness every act I commit with your hands, every life I ruin, every person I hurt. You'll feel the guilt, oh yes, I can sense your emotions, but you'll be powerless to stop it." "No," Joshua thought desperately, "please." Begging now? But you were so brave before. Where's that unshakable courage, that famous strength? The entity laughed. "You cannot fight me, Joshua Garrett. You are not strong enough. No one is." And it was right. Joshua had spent his entire life believing that courage and strength were enough to overcome any obstacle. He'd faced down criminals, natural disasters, his own mortality, and never flinched. But he'd never faced something truly beyond human capability to resist. He'd never met a problem that couldn't be punched, outmaneuvered, or endured. Until now. The entity walked Joshua's body back to his truck, whistling a tune that had been ancient when Rome was young. It had plans. So many plans. And it had all the time in the world to execute them. In his mental prison, Joshua Garrett, the unshakable, the brave, the strong, finally understood true helplessness. And the worst part, the part that would torment him for every single day of his decades-long imprisonment, was that this was entirely his fault. He'd offered himself willingly. He'd thought he could save someone and walk away. He'd believed, right up until the moment the entity entered him, that he was in control. He'd been so very, very wrong. 3 months later, Melissa attended Joshua's funeral. Well, not his actual funeral. His body was very much alive, walking around, doing its job. But she'd organized a memorial for the Joshua she'd known. The friend who'd saved her life, but who seemed to have changed fundamentally after that day in the forest. She'd tried to reconnect with him, but the man who'd rescued her wasn't the same man anymore. He was colder, crueler in subtle ways. He'd made comments that cut too deep, had developed a sadistic sense of humor, had started to frighten her. Others had noticed too. His girlfriend had left him. His colleagues avoided him when possible. He still did his job, brilliantly even, but there was something off about him now, something wrong. "It's like he's not even there anymore," Melissa told the small gathering. "Like something broke in him that day." I wish I knew what happened. I wish I could help him. But there was no help. Not for Joshua. In his apartment across town, the entity inhabiting Joshua's body watched the memorial service through social media, finding the whole thing incredibly amusing. It had successfully isolated Joshua's body from everyone who'd cared about him, had destroyed his relationships, had tainted his reputation. And the beauty was that everyone blamed Joshua himself for the changes. No one suspected possession. No one believed in demons. They just thought he'd changed, become darker, meaner. They mourned who he'd been while slowly withdrawing from who he'd become. Perfect. Inside his mental prison, Joshua screamed and screamed and screamed into the void, unheard by anyone, powerless to even move a single finger of his own body. The entity had been right. His courage meant nothing. His strength was irrelevant. He'd spent his life believing he was unshakable, and now he'd been shaken to his very core, broken in ways he hadn't known were possible. And it was going to last for decades. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Author's note. This story incorporates authentic elements from demonology and occult practices, including references to real grimoires such as the Clavicula Salomonis, Key of Solomon, and the Lemegeton, Lesser Key of Solomon. Astaroth is a genuine figure from Western demonology, described in various occult texts as a powerful Duke of Hell. The Latin incantations used are based on actual ritual formats from historical grimoires, though modified for narrative purposes. The ritualistic elements, including the use of blood, sacred geometry, and specific invocation methods, draw from documented occult practices spanning multiple traditions. Ashley Blackwood had been a ranger at Cascade Ridge National Park for 14 years, and in that time she'd learned to read the wilderness like other people read newspapers. She knew which trails flooded in spring, where black bears denned in winter, and exactly how many steps it took to reach the fire lookout tower from the main station. At 37, with commendations from the National Park Service and a reputation for finding lost hikers that bordered on legendary, Ashley had earned her confidence. She'd pulled hypothermic climbers off mountaintops, talked down suicidal jumpers at Eagles Peak, and once tracked a disoriented Alzheimer's patient for 3 days through terrain that had broken younger rangers. The wilderness was her domain, and she wore that knowledge like armor. The morning Mia Chen went missing started like any other October day in the park. Ashley arrived at the ranger station at 6 a.m., the pre-dawn darkness still thick between the towering Douglas firs. She'd been doing this job long enough that her body moved through the opening routine on autopilot, unlocking the station, firing up the ancient coffee maker, checking the overnight log, reviewing the weather report. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-50s, perfect conditions for the handful of hikers who'd registered for backcountry permits the previous day. She was halfway through her first cup of coffee when Tom Reeves, the junior ranger who worked the graveyard shift, shuffled in from the back room looking like he'd seen a ghost. Tom was 24, fresh out of forestry school, still soft around the edges in ways that made Ashley's more experienced colleagues roll their eyes. But Ashley remembered being young and uncertain, so she'd taken him under her wing, teaching him how to really see the forest instead of just looking at it. "We've got a problem," Tom said, his voice tight. "Hiker didn't check in last night. Mia Chen, 26, solo backpacker. She was supposed to be out on the Whispering Creek Trail 3-day permit, should have radioed in from the Lost Lake shelter by 8 p.m. Ashley set down her coffee, her mind already shifting into search mode. Could be radio malfunction. Could be she decided to push on to the next shelter. "That's what I thought," Tom said, pulling out the registration form. "But I called the emergency contact, her sister in Seattle. She said Mia's been checking in religiously every night, texts, photos, the whole thing. Hasn't heard anything since yesterday morning." Ashley studied the registration form, noting the careful handwriting, the detailed itinerary, the list of emergency supplies. Experienced hiker by the looks of it, not the type to blow off protocol. How long has she been overdue? 10 hours. Not technically an emergency yet, but Ashley's instincts were already prickling. 14 years in these mountains had given her a sense for when something was wrong, a subtle discordance in the natural order of things. She couldn't explain it, didn't try to, but she'd learned to trust it. "I'll take a run out to Lost Lake," Ashley said, already moving toward the equipment lockers. "Radio her sister, tell her we're on it. And Tom, call in Ramirez and Henderson. Tell them to be ready for a full search protocol if I don't find her by noon." The drive to the Whispering Creek trailhead took 40 minutes, the ranger truck winding through narrow mountain roads as the sun finally crested the eastern peaks, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Ashley used the time to run through scenarios in her head. Medical emergency, fall, animal encounter, equipment failure, lost. In 14 years, she'd seen all of them, and she'd brought people back from all of them. This would be no different. The parking area at the trailhead was nearly empty, just Mia's blue Honda Civic and one other vehicle, probably a day hiker already on the trail. Ashley parked and spent 5 minutes examining Mia's car, peering through the windows at the neat interior, the emergency blanket visible in the back seat, the National Park Service permit displayed properly on the dashboard. Everything about this woman suggested competence, preparation, experience, which made her silence all the more troubling. Ashley shouldered her pack, 40 pounds of emergency supplies, medical gear, and search equipment that she could carry for miles without breaking a sweat, and headed into the forest. The Whispering Creek Trail was one of the park's more remote routes, 8 miles of challenging terrain that wound through old-growth forest before opening up to Lost Lake, a pristine alpine basin that was worth every blister. Ashley knew every switchback, every water crossing, every landmark. The morning was beautiful in that particular way that only October in the Pacific Northwest could manage, the air crisp and clean, the light slanting through the trees in dusty golden shafts. Mushrooms dotted the forest floor, and somewhere overhead a Stellar's jay called out its harsh warning. Ashley moved fast but methodically, her eyes scanning the trail for any sign of disturbance. Broken branches, disturbed earth, blood, equipment, anything. She found the first anomaly 2 miles in. The trail crossed Whispering Creek at a natural ford, usually an easy hop across water-worn stones. But as Ashley approached, she noticed something that made her slow, then stop. The stones that formed the crossing were still there, but they'd been rearranged. Not by water. Ashley knew what flood damage looked like, and this wasn't it. These stones had been deliberately repositioned, placed in a pattern that was almost but not quite circular, leaving a gap in the center where the water flowed through unimpeded. Ashley knelt beside the strange formation, her hand hovering over the stones without quite touching them. They were covered in what looked like scratches, shallow marks that could have been made by tools or something else. Her rational mind supplied explanations. Other hikers messing around, natural erosion creating coincidental patterns. But that prickling instinct was back, stronger now, telling her that something here was fundamentally wrong. She took photos with her camera, documented the location on her GPS, and moved on. But the unease stayed with her, a cold weight settling in her gut. 3 miles in, she found the second anomaly. A tree had fallen across the trail, not unusual in itself as windstorms regularly toppled the shallower-rooted hemlocks. But this tree hadn't been blown over. It had been cut. Ashley could see the marks clearly, deep gouges in the wood that formed a rough circle around the trunk, as if something had gnawed through it with methodical patience. The tree was massive, easily 4 feet in diameter, and whatever had brought it down had done so with enough force to shatter the trunk into jagged splinters. No chainsaw had done this, no axe. The marks were wrong, too irregular, too deep. Ashley stood there for a long moment, her mind trying to reconcile what she was seeing with her 14 years of experience. Black bears could claw trees, but they didn't fell them. Mountain lions didn't bother with trees at all. And there were no grizzlies in this part of the Cascades, hadn't been for a century. She keyed her radio. "Base, this is Blackwood. You copy?" Static crackled, then Tom's voice came through. "Copy, Ashley. What's your status?" "I'm at mile marker 3 on Whispering Creek. Found some unusual signs. Tree down across the trail, but it wasn't wind damage. Looks like it was attacked." Also found stones rearranged at the creek crossing. A pause. Attacked? By what? Unknown. Could be vandals, could be... I don't know, I'm documenting everything, no sign of our missing hiker yet. Continuing to Lost Lake. Copy that. Be careful out there. Always am. But as Ashley climbed over the fallen tree, carefully photographing the strange marks before she went, she realized that the confidence in her voice was starting to feel like a lie. The trail climbed steadily after the fallen tree, switchbacking up through dense forest toward the alpine zone. Ashley's legs pumped mechanically, her breathing steady despite the elevation gain. This was the kind of terrain that broke inexperienced hikers, but for Ashley, it was just another day at work. She'd run this trail dozens of times, knew every root and rock, every steep pitch and flat stretch. But today something felt different. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against her eardrums like deep water. Ashley had experienced quiet forests before. Predators could silence prey animals with their mere presence, but this was something else. This felt like the silence before a storm, pregnant with threat. 4 miles in, she found Mia's first campsite. The backpacker had set up in a designated camping area just off the trail, a flat space beneath a massive cedar that had been used by hikers for decades. Ashley could see the tent pad's compressed earth, could identify where Mia had hung her food bag in the bear-proof cable system, could spot the fire ring where she'd probably cooked dinner. But the campsite itself was a disaster. The tent was still there, but it had been shredded, not torn by wind or clawed by animals, but systematically destroyed. Long rents in the fabric that suggested deliberate violence. Mia's backpack lay 15 feet away, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Clothing, food bags, a water filter, a paperback novel with its pages ripped out and scattered like confetti. Ashley's training kicked in, overriding the cold dread that was trying to take root in her chest. She documented everything with her camera, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. This was no longer just a search and rescue. This was potentially a crime scene. She keyed her radio again. Base Blackwood. I'm at the designated campsite, mile 4. Evidence of major disturbance. Tent destroyed, gear scattered. No blood visible, no sign of the hiker. Requesting immediate backup and notifying county sheriff. This is now a potential crime scene. Tom's voice came back immediately, higher pitched with alarm. Copy that. Should you stay there? Wait for backup? Ashley looked at the destroyed campsite, at the scattered pages of the novel fluttering in a breeze that hadn't existed moments before, at the deep gouges in the earth that led away from the tent toward the deeper forest. Those gouges looked like the marks on the fallen tree, like something heavy had dragged itself through the dirt, its claws scoring the earth with each movement. Negative, Ashley said. Trail is still fresh. I'm going to track as far as Lost Lake. If I don't find her there, I'll hold position and wait for backup. She didn't wait for Tom's response. She was already moving, following those strange drag marks into the forest, her hand unconsciously checking the bear spray on her belt, even though she knew with growing certainty that whatever had done this wasn't a bear. The drag marks led off trail, weaving between trees with seemingly random purpose. Ashley followed carefully, marking her route with surveyor's tape every 50 feet so she could find her way back. The forest pressed in around her, darker now as the canopy thickened overhead. The silence had deepened impossibly, until she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could hear the whisper of her own breathing. And then she saw them. The symbols. They were carved into tree trunks at irregular intervals, each one maybe 8 inches tall, cut deep into the bark with something sharp. Ashley stopped at the first one, her hand reaching out to trace the lines. It looked almost like a figure, a stick person rendered in harsh angular strokes, but wrong somehow. The proportions were distorted, the limbs too long, the head too large, and around the figure, circular marks that might have been writing in a language Ashley didn't recognize. She photographed it, then moved to the next tree. Another symbol, similar but different. The figure was the same, but the surrounding marks had changed. A pattern, she realized. A sequence. Like a story being told in a language older than words. Ashley had minored in anthropology in college, had taken courses in Native American history and culture. She knew that the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Salish, the Chinook, the Yakima, had used carved symbols for territory markers and spiritual warnings. But these symbols didn't match anything she'd seen in textbooks or museums. These were something else entirely. Her radio crackled. "Ashley, this is Henderson. Tom briefed me. What's your location?" Ashley checked her GPS, surprised to realize she'd traveled nearly a mile off trail. "I'm about a mile northeast of the designated campsite, following what appears to be drag marks and carved symbols. Henderson, have you ever seen anything like Native American petroglyphs in this area?" "Petroglyphs? No, nothing documented. Why?" "Because I'm looking at what might be either very old cultural artifacts or the work of someone very sick. The symbols show some kind of figure, humanoid but distorted. They're leading me deeper into the forest." Henderson's voice took on a harder edge. "Ashley, you need to stop. If there's someone out there doing this, someone who's potentially violent, you shouldn't be tracking alone. Come back to the campsite and wait for us." Ashley knew he was right. Standard protocol said to wait for backup in potential criminal situations. But she was also looking at those drag marks continuing into the forest, disappearing into the darkening trees, and thinking about Mia Chen, 26 years old, who checked in with her sister religiously, and who might still be alive, might still be saved if Ashley just kept moving. "I'm going to Lost Lake," Ashley said. "If she made it that far, if she's at the shelter there, that's our best chance. I'll be careful." "Ashley," she switched off the radio. The forest grew denser as she climbed, the old-growth giants giving way to smaller, twisted trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches interlocking overhead like grasping fingers. The drag marks continued, sometimes disappearing on bare stone before reappearing in soft earth. The symbols appeared with increasing frequency, the carved figures growing larger, more detailed, more disturbing. And that's when Ashley started to notice something else. The trees themselves were wrong, not just in shape, though many were indeed twisted in ways that suggested disease or damage, but in their arrangement. They formed patterns, she realized, not the random distribution of natural forest growth, but deliberate patterns. Circles within circles, spirals, formations that reminded her of sacred geometry, of the kind of layouts she'd seen in books about ancient religious sites. Her 14 years of experience had no explanation for this. Her training, her accumulated knowledge, her hard-won expertise, none of it could account for what she was seeing. And for the first time since she'd become a ranger, Ashley felt something she'd almost forgotten. Fear. Not the healthy respect for danger that kept her sharp in the wilderness, but genuine primal fear. The kind that made her ancestors hide in caves when predators prowled in the night. She forced herself to keep moving. Mia. Think about Mia. 26 years old. Someone's sister. Someone who needed help. The Lost Lake shelter came into view just after noon, a rough wooden structure tucked into a clearing at the edge of the alpine lake. Ashley had been there dozens of times, knew every board and nail, but as she emerged from the tree line, she stopped dead in her tracks. The shelter was covered in symbols. Every surface, walls, roof, door had been carved with those same disturbing figures, hundreds of them, overlapping and intertwining until the entire structure seemed to writhe with that distorted, inhuman form. And in the center of the clearing, arranged in concentric circles around the shelter, were stones, dozens of them, each one carefully placed, each one carved with those same unknown characters. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't the work of confused hikers or teenage pranksters. This was ritualistic, purposeful, ancient. Ashley approached slowly, her bear spray in hand, even though she knew it would be useless against whatever had created this. The shelter door was open, swinging slightly in a breeze that Ashley still couldn't feel. She could see darkness inside, could smell something wrong. Not decay, not exactly, but something organic and old, like opening a tomb. "Mia?" she called out, her voice sounding small and fragile in the oppressive silence. "Mia Chen? This is Park Ranger Ashley Blackwood. If you're in there, if you can hear me, please respond." Nothing. Ashley stepped into the clearing, her boots crunching on the carefully arranged stones. Each step felt like a violation, like she was trespassing in a space where humans were not meant to walk. The symbols on the shelter seemed to move in her peripheral vision, writhing and shifting, though when she looked directly at them they were still just carvings in old wood. She reached the door and pushed it fully open, flooding the interior with daylight. The shelter was empty. No Mia, no camping gear, nothing but more symbols, carved into the floorboards in patterns so complex they made Ashley's eyes hurt to look at them. And in the very center, burned into the wood with what must have been incredible heat, was a single word in English. Chosen. Ashley felt her legs go weak. She grabbed the doorframe for support, her rational mind trying desperately to make sense of what she was seeing. Someone had done this. Someone human. It had to be someone human. People carved symbols. People built stone circles. People burned words into wood. People. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones, could feel it in the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath around this place. Whatever had taken Mia, whatever had created this nightmare, it wasn't human. It had never been human. Her radio crackled to life, making her jump. Henderson's voice cut through the static. "Ashley, if you can hear this, we're at the campsite. We found something. You need to come back. Now." Ashley keyed her radio with shaking hands. "I'm at Lost Lake. The shelter. Henderson, the shelter is covered in symbols. Hundreds of them. And someone burned the word, chosen, into the floor." A long pause filled with static and something else. Fear, Ashley realized. Henderson was scared. She'd worked with the man for 6 years and had never heard fear in his voice. "Ashley," he said slowly, carefully, "when was the last time you looked at the park's history records? The deep history from before it was a national park?" "What are you talking about?" "There's a file in the station. Old reports dating back to the 1920s. Hikers going missing, always in October. Always single hikers, always found near Lost Lake, except there's never any bodies. Just symbols carved in trees. The reports stop in 1954 because the local Native American elder who'd been helping with searches told the rangers to close this trail. Told them there was something up here that predated human settlement, something that woke every 19 years during the Orionid meteor shower. Ashley felt cold sweat break out across her body. The Orionids peak tonight. "I know. Ashley, get out of there. Get out now. We're coming up, but we're at least 2 hours behind you." "What did the elder say was up here? What did he call it?" Another pause. Then, he didn't have a name for it in English. Just said that every 19 years, when the star wounds opened in the sky, the hunger that walks would come down from the high places to feed. Said it was part of a prophecy older than the mountains, that the earth itself had made a bargain for fertility, and the price was blood. Ashley's hands were shaking now. 19 years. She did the math in her head. 1935, 1954, 1973, 1992, 2011, and now 2030. No. The current year was 2011. The meteor shower was tonight, and she was standing in the exact place where whatever this was had been taking people for at least a century. "I'm coming back," she said. A sound cut through the forest. Not an animal sound. Not a human sound. Something between the two. A wet, rasping cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed off the mountains, multiplied and distorted until Ashley couldn't tell where it originated. And then the forest erupted with movement. The trees around the shelter began to sway despite the absence of wind. The stone circles seemed to glow with a faint, sickly light. And from the tree line, from multiple points along the tree line, shapes began to emerge. They walked on 2 legs, but that's where the resemblance to humans ended. They were tall, impossibly tall, their bodies elongated and twisted like the trees around them. Their skin, if it could be called skin, was the color of old bone, stretched tight over angular frames that bent at wrong angles. Their heads were too large, dominated by mouths that opened too wide, filled with teeth that were less like teeth and more like shards of stone. But it was their eyes that made Ashley's mind try to shut down. They had too many eyes. Dozens of them scattered across their faces and necks and chests like stars in a nightmare sky. And each eye reflected not Ashley's image, but something else. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. There were 7 of them. They moved in perfect synchronization, stepping over the stone circles in a pattern that matched the symbols carved everywhere, and in the center of their formation, suspended between 2 of the creatures by some invisible force, was Mia Chen. She was alive. Ashley could see her chest rising and falling, but her eyes were closed, and her body was completely still, and around her neck was a collar made of woven branches and symbols and something that looked horribly like finger bones. The creatures stopped at the edge of the clearing. The largest one, the one directly in front of Ashley, tilted its head in an almost curious gesture. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dead leaves, like stones grinding together, like the death rattle of something ancient and cruel. "Ranger," it said, the word distorted but recognizable. "You were not chosen. Why have you come to the feeding ground?" Ashley's training said to run. Her instincts screamed to run. But she was looking at Mia, at the young woman suspended in the air like an offering, and something deeper than training or instinct took over. She was a park ranger. She protected people. That was her job. That was her identity. That was who she was. "Let her go," Ashley said, amazed that her voice was steady. "Whatever you are, whatever this is, you can't have her." The creature made a sound that might have been laughter. "Cannot? We have had our chosen for 19 cycles of 19 harvests. The prophecy was carved in stone when your kind still swung from trees. The earth gave us this compact. We protect the green places, and in return, we feed when the star wounds open. It is the way of balance." "That's not balance, that's murder." "Is it murder when you harvest wheat? When you slaughter cattle? You feed on what is beneath you in the great cycle. We feed on what is beneath us. The prophecy demands it. The mountains themselves will sicken without our feeding." Ashley's mind was racing. The creature was talking about mythology as if it were fact, about prophecies as if they were natural law. And somewhere in her memory, she recalled her anthropology classes, recalled reading about cultures that believed in literal cosmic balance, in the idea that supernatural entities maintained the health of the natural world through ritual sacrifice. The Algonquian Wendigo, the Pacific Northwest Basket Woman, the Zuni death spirits. All of them tied to natural cycles, all of them demanding blood to maintain cosmic order. "There has to be another way," Ashley said. "If you're part of the natural order, if you're guardians of these mountains, then you have to understand change. Adaptation. Humans don't make blood sacrifices anymore. We've found other ways to maintain balance." The creature tilted its head further, at an angle that should have broken its neck. "Your ways have brought sickness to the green places. The air grows warm, the waters grow bitter, the animals vanish. You do not maintain balance, you destroy it. We are the old ways. We are the prophecy made flesh. We are the hunger that keeps the world turning." It stepped forward, and Ashley saw with horror that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. It was walking on air, on invisible platforms that corresponded to the stone circles, following a path only it could see. "The stars will wound the sky tonight," it continued. "The chosen will feed us, and the mountains will grow strong for another 19 harvests. This is unchangeable. This is prophecy. This is the way of things." "No," Ashley said. She pulled out her bear spray, knowing it was useless, knowing nothing in her 14 years of experience had prepared her for this. "I don't care about prophecies. I don't care about ancient bargains. That woman is under my protection. You can't have her." The creature stopped. All 7 of them stopped. And in that moment, Ashley saw something flicker across those too many eyes. Recognition, maybe. Respect, possibly. Or perhaps just curiosity about this tiny human who dared to challenge forces older than civilization. "You would bargain?" the creature asked. "You would stand between us and prophecy?" Ashley's mind was screaming at her to shut up, to run, to do anything except what she was about to do. But she thought about Mia's sister in Seattle, waiting for a phone call. She thought about the file Henderson had mentioned, the decades of missing hikers, the families never knowing what happened. She thought about her own 14 years of bringing people home. "Yes," she said. "I'll bargain, I'll stand. That's my job." The creature moved faster than thought. One moment it was 10 feet away, the next it was inches from Ashley's face, its too many eyes boring into her soul. She could smell it now. Not decay, but something like ozone and copper and old earth, the smell of things that should stay buried. "Brave," it whispered. "Foolish, but brave. Very well, Ranger. We offer you ancient law, a substitution. The prophecy demands one chosen every 19 harvests, but it does not specify which one. If you take the chosen's place, if you wear the collar of binding, if you walk the path to the high places where we dwell between feedings, we will release her. One life for another. The balance maintained. The prophecy fulfilled." Ashley's blood turned to ice. It was offering her a deal, her life for Mia's, and everything in her ranger training, everything in her survivor's instinct, was telling her to refuse, to fight, to run. But she looked at Mia's unconscious face, looked at the bone collar around her throat, and knew there was only one answer she could give. "I accept," Ashley said. "Let her go, and I'll take her place." The creatures moved as one. The two holding Mia lowered her to the ground with surprising gentleness, removing the collar from her neck. The young woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. The largest creature moved behind Ashley, and she felt something cold and hard settle around her own neck. The bone collar binding her to an ancient prophecy she still didn't fully understand. "The bargain is sealed," the creature said. "When the star wounds open tonight, you will walk the path. You will join us in the high places. You will become part of the cycle, part of the balance, part of the hunger. This is your choice freely made." Ashley wanted to scream, wanted to claw at the collar, wanted to run, but she forced herself to stay still, to stay calm. Will she remember? Will Mia remember what happened? No, the unchosen never remember. She will wake confused, believing she lost her way. She will return to her life. She will grow old and die never knowing how close she came to prophecy. "Good," Ashley whispered. That's good." The creature bent close, its impossible face inches from hers. "You have until sunset, Ranger. Until the star wounds open. Walk the path when darkness falls or the substitution fails and we claim you both. These are the terms. These are the ways of prophecy." And then, as impossibly fast as they'd appeared, the creatures were gone. They didn't walk away, didn't fade. They simply ceased to be there, leaving Ashley alone in the clearing with the stone circles and the symbol-covered shelter, and Mia Chen, who was stirring on the ground with no memory of the nightmare she'd just escaped. Ashley knelt beside the young woman, helping her sit up. "Easy," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the bone collar around her neck. "You're okay. You're at Lost Lake. You got disoriented, but you're okay now." Mia blinked up at her, confused. What happened? I was hiking and then... I don't remember. Did I fall?" "Probably a minor concussion," Ashley lied smoothly. "Can happen when you're dehydrated. Let's get you back to the station, get you checked out." She helped Mia to her feet, doing a quick medical assessment that her training made automatic despite the horror churning in her gut. Physically fine, no injuries. Mentally shaken but coherent. She'd be okay. She'd go home to her sister, live her life, never knowing what had almost happened. Ashley keyed her radio. "Base, this is Blackwood. I found Mia Chen. She's safe. We're heading back now." Henderson's voice came back immediately, flooded with relief. "Thank God. What happened up there? We heard..." "Radio malfunction on her end," Ashley said, cutting him off. "She got disoriented. Minor dehydration. I'll give you a full report when we get back." She switched off before he could ask more questions. Mia was looking at her with grateful but confused eyes, clearly trying to piece together what had happened. Ashley gave her a ranger's smile, confident, reassuring, completely false. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you home." The hike back took 3 hours. Ashley matched her pace to Mia's, keeping up a steady stream of small talk that required minimal responses. The young woman was recovering quickly, her memory of the past day fragmented and unclear, exactly as the creature had promised. By the time they reached the trailhead, Mia was already constructing a narrative that made sense to her. She'd pushed too hard, gotten dehydrated, become disoriented, waited at the shelter for help. Henderson was waiting at the trailhead with an ambulance, looking haggard but relieved. He took one look at Ashley's face and knew something was wrong, but he didn't say anything, just helped load Mia into the ambulance for the trip to the hospital for observation. "Ashley," he said quietly, after Mia was out of earshot. "What really happened up there?" Ashley touched the collar around her neck, invisible now, or at least invisible to human eyes, but she could feel it, cold and binding. "I need you to do something for me. That file you mentioned, the historical reports. I need to read everything before sunset." "Why? What's going on?" "Please, Henderson, just trust me. I need to understand." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "The file's in my truck. But Ashley, whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone. Let me help." "You can't," Ashley said simply. "But thank you." She spent the next 4 hours in Henderson's truck, reading through yellowed reports and faded photographs, piecing together the history of the Lost Lake disappearances. It was all there, documented in the careful handwriting of rangers long dead. October 1935. Margaret Walsh, age 24, last seen near Lost Lake, found signs of ritualistic markings. October 1954. James Park, age 29, vanished from the shelter. Extensive search revealed carved symbols on trees. October 1973. Linda Martinez, age 31, disappeared during the Orionid meteor shower. Local tribal elder refused to participate in search. October 1992. Robert Chen, age 27, missing. Search called off after weather turned. Each report included sketches of the symbols, and Ashley recognized them all. The elongated figures, the circular writing, the patterns that hurt to look at too long. Each report noted the same 19-year cycle. Each report ended with no body recovered, no explanation given, but there was one additional document tucked at the back of the file. A handwritten letter from the tribal elder who'd told the rangers to close the trail in 1954. Ashley read it with growing horror. These are not things that can be fought with guns or dogs or helicopters. These are the first ones, the beings that walked the earth before humans learned to speak. They made a covenant with the land itself, protection for the forests in exchange for blood when the star showers fell. Every 19 years, when the celestial cycle returns, they wake and demand their due. It is prophecy. It is balance. It is the way of things. Do not seek to change this. Do not seek to understand. Simply accept that there are older laws than human laws, and those who violate those laws become part of the price. Close the trail. Forget the Lost Lake. Let the old ways continue in silence. Ashley closed the file as the sun touched the western peaks. She had perhaps an hour until full darkness, until the Orionid meteors would begin their annual display, until the star wounds would open, and she would have to fulfill her bargain. Henderson had left her alone, respecting her need for privacy. She sat in the truck and thought about her life, about 14 years of helping people, about all the hikers she'd brought home safely. She thought about Mia, who would wake up in a hospital tomorrow with no memory of horror, who would go home to her sister and live a normal life. That was worth something, Ashley told herself. That had to be worth something. As the last light faded from the sky, she drove back to the Whispering Creek trailhead. The parking lot was empty now, just her Ranger truck under the darkening sky. Above, the first meteors were beginning to streak across the heavens. The Orionids, the star wounds, the celestial signal that had been calling these creatures for longer than human civilization. Ashley shouldered her pack one last time and headed into the forest. She didn't need her headlamp. The bone collar around her neck seemed to glow with its own faint light, illuminating a path she hadn't noticed before. It led off trail, deeper into the forest, climbing toward the high peaks where the tree line broke and the rock began. She walked for hours, following the path that only she could see, the collar growing warmer around her neck. The symbols were everywhere now, carved into every surface, glowing with that same sickly light. And as she climbed higher, she began to see others. They were rangers, she realized. Or they had been, once. Now they were something else. Thin, elongated, their bodies twisted into that familiar distorted form. But she could still see their humanity in their eyes, could still see the awareness, the terrible consciousness trapped inside transformed flesh. This was the price. This was the prophecy. Not death, but transformation. Becoming one of them, becoming part of the cycle, becoming the hunger that walked. At the summit, where the mountain touched the sky and the meteors blazed overhead like wounds in heaven, they were waiting. All 7 of them, arranged in that same perfect formation. The largest one stepped forward, its too many eyes reflecting the meteor shower, reflecting Ashley's face, reflecting something vast and terrible and infinitely patient. "You came," it said. "You honored the bargain." The prophecy continues. The balance holds. Ashley looked at the former rangers standing silent in the shadows, looked at the meteors streaking overhead, looked at her own hands and wondered how long it would take before they twisted into something unrecognizable. "Will I remember?" she asked. "Will I know who I was?" "You will remember everything," the creature said, and there was something almost like pity in its grinding voice. "The transformation takes decades, Ranger. You will have many years to understand, to accept, to become. By the time the next cycle arrives, when the star wounds open again in 19 harvests, you will be ready to walk among us, to choose the next one, to maintain the prophecy. And if I refuse, if I fight it, then the bargain breaks, and we claim not only you but all those you sought to save. Every hiker you ever brought home, every life you preserved, we will take to restore the balance you disrupted. This is ancient law. This is unchangeable." Ashley closed her eyes. She thought about Mia, safely in a hospital bed. She thought about Henderson and Tom and all the rangers she'd worked with. She thought about the thousands of hikers who'd walked these trails safely because she'd been here to guide them. "I understand," she whispered. The collar grew hot, burning against her skin. The meteors overhead seemed to pause in their endless fall, and Ashley Blackwood, veteran ranger of Cascade Ridge National Park, took the first step on a path that would last 19 years, until the next time the star wounds opened and she would stand on the other side, choosing the next one to walk this terrible path. The prophecy would continue, the balance would hold, the hunger would be fed, and in the morning, Henderson would find her truck at the trailhead with a note on the dashboard. "Took early retirement. Don't look for me. Some trails aren't meant to be followed." He would remember the conversation about the historical reports, would remember the fear in her eyes, would understand somewhere deep down that she had made a choice he couldn't follow. The file would remain in the station, a warning that no one would heed. The Lost Lake Trail would stay open, and every 19 years, when the Orionids painted the sky with their burning light, someone would walk into those mountains and not come back. The cycle would continue, the prophecy would be fulfilled, the ancient covenant would hold. And Ashley, walking into the high places with the creatures that had once been human, would have 19 years to learn the terrible truth, that some sacrifices weren't about saving others, but about becoming the very thing that required sacrifice. That prophecies didn't just predict the future, they created it. That the oldest laws were written in blood and bone, and endless hunger. That some paths, once chosen, could never be walked back. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? David Mercer had been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for exactly 3 months when Ryan Torres disappeared. 3 months of monitoring trail conditions, giving directions to lost hikers, and filing incident reports about campfire violations. 3 months of pretending he knew what he was doing while the veterans like Martinez and Chen handled the real emergencies. 3 months of being the rookie who everyone knew would probably wash out before his first year ended, just like the last 2 greenhorns before him. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on October 23, 2018. David had been dozing at the desk in the remote northern station, a cramped wooden structure that smelled of mildew and old coffee, when his radio crackled with static so violent it made him jump. Then Ryan's voice cut through, and David would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd never answered. David, if you're there, oh God, please be there." Ryan's voice was barely recognizable, compressed into a wheezing whisper that seemed to struggle through the static. They'd gone through the basic training together, had shared beers and complaints about the bureaucracy, had bonded over being the only 2 rookies assigned to Blackwood that season. Ryan had been stationed at the southern access point, nearly 40 miles away through dense forest and mountain terrain. David grabbed the radio, his hands already shaking, though he didn't yet understand why. "Ryan? What's wrong? What's your 20? Don't come looking for me." Ryan's words came out in a rush, desperate and slurred. "Whatever you do, don't." "They're doing something, David. The old trail, the one that's not on the maps. There are symbols everywhere, carved into the trees, painted on rocks. Circle with the star inside, but it's wrong. It's got too many points and there are names written around it. Latin, I think, or maybe Hebrew. And the smell, Jesus Christ, the smell of burning." Static consumed the transmission. David pressed the button frantically. Ryan, stay calm. I'm calling this in. What's your exact location?" When Ryan's voice returned, it was quieter, flatter, as though something fundamental had been drained from it. "They found me, David. They've been watching me this whole time. There's a woman here, but her eyes are wrong, all black, like she doesn't have pupils at all. She's speaking, but her mouth isn't moving and I can hear the words inside my head. She says the circle must be fed. She says they've been preparing for months, following the lunar calendar, waiting for the dark moon. Tonight. It has to be tonight." "Who are they?" "Ryan, who's there with you?" David was already pulling on his jacket, grabbing his flashlight and emergency pack. His training manual said to wait for backup in situations like this, to never go alone into a potential hostile scenario. But there was no backup at this hour, not for at least 2 hours, even if he called it in immediately. The main ranger station was in town, 50 miles of winding mountain roads away. There are 12 of them, standing in a circle around something in the center. I can't see what it is, but it's moving, writhing. They're all wearing these robes, dark red like dried blood. And they're chanting David. It sounds old, really old. Astaroth, Asmodeus, Belith. Names. So many names. They keep repeating them over and over. David's blood went cold. Those were demon names. He'd heard them before, years ago, when his grandmother had warned him about his uncle's involvement with some occult group in Nevada. She'd made him memorize protective prayers, told him to never speak those names aloud, said some doors once opened could never be closed. At the time, he'd thought she was just superstitious, her mind softening with age. Now those childhood warnings flooded back with terrible clarity. "Ryan, listen to me. Get out of there, right now. Don't worry about protocol or getting seen. Just run." David's voice cracked with an urgency he'd never felt before. "I can't." The words were hollow. "My legs won't move. It's like I'm stuck here watching. The woman is looking at me now. She's smiling. David, her teeth are all wrong. Too many of them, and they're pointed. She says I should feel honored. She says I'm the catalyst, the final offering before the real work begins." The real work, what does that mean? The opening. Ryan's breathing had become ragged, punctuated by small whimpers he seemed unable to control. She keeps saying it. The opening. They're going to tear through the boundary. Bring something across. Something that's been waiting for centuries. The ritual requires specific components. Blood from the willing, bone from the innocent, flesh from the... The scream that tore through the radio wasn't human. It started in Ryan's register but quickly climbed into frequencies that made David's teeth ache, made his vision blur at the edges. It went on and on, impossibly long, until it cut off with a wet final sound that David knew he'd hear in every nightmare for the rest of his life. Then silence. Complete and absolute. Ryan? Ryan? Only static answered, punctuated by something that might have been breathing, or might have been wind through trees, or might have been something else entirely. David stood there for a full 30 seconds, the radio clutched in his white-knuckled grip, his mind refusing to process what he'd just heard. Then training kicked in, the thin veneer of procedure that was all he had to cling to. He grabbed the emergency phone and dialed the main station. It rang 15 times before going to voicemail. He tried Martinez's cell. No answer. Chen's number. Straight to voicemail. The isolation of the northern station had never felt more suffocating. He was alone, completely alone, and Ryan, his friend, his fellow rookie, the guy who'd saved him from making a fool of himself in front of the superintendent during their first week, was out there somewhere in the dark, possibly dying or already dead. David's hands shook as he pulled out the topographical map of Blackwood National Forest. The official trails were marked in green, but there were older marks too, faded pencil lines that showed paths from before the park had been officially established. His supervisor had mentioned them once, said they were from when this had been logging territory back in the 1920s, before most of the land had been purchased and protected. Some of those trails had never been mapped officially because they were too dangerous, too remote, or because they led to areas where the terrain was unstable, or, David thought with growing dread, because someone wanted them forgotten. He traced his finger along the map, looking for anything that might match Ryan's description. There, about 8 miles northeast of the southern station, there was a faded pencil mark that led off the main trail into a section marked with a small notation, Old Millstone Hollow, condemned 1927. David grabbed his pack, his radio, his service weapon that he'd only ever fired on the range, and headed for his truck. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was wrong, that he should wait, that he was violating every protocol in the manual. But Ryan's scream echoed in his memory, and the hollow resignation in his voice just before the end. The opening. Whatever that meant, it was happening tonight. And David was the only one who knew. The drive through the dark forest felt surreal, his headlights carving tunnels through the blackness, while ancient trees pressed in from both sides. The road to the southern station was barely maintained, more of a fire access route than a proper road, and his truck bounced violently over ruts and exposed roots. The whole way, David kept expecting his radio to crackle back to life, to hear Ryan's voice again, even scared, even terrified, just to know he was still alive. But the radio remained silent except for occasional bursts of static that sounded almost rhythmic, almost like chanting. He reached the southern station at 12:43 a.m. Ryan's truck was parked outside, driver's door hanging open, keys still in the ignition. The station door was also open, swinging slightly in the cold October wind. David approached cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the interior. Papers were scattered across the desk, a coffee mug had spilled, but there were no signs of struggle. Whatever had pulled Ryan out into the forest had done so without violence, at least not here. David's flashlight beam caught something on the desk and his breath caught. A book lay open, old leather binding cracked and stained. The pages were covered in dense handwritten text, Latin mixed with symbols he didn't recognize. Someone, Ryan, had been taking notes on a separate pad of paper, copying the symbols, trying to translate the passages. David leaned closer, his skin crawling as he read Ryan's hasty scrawl. Ars Goetia, the lesser key of Solomon, 72 demons, each with specific sigils and invocations. This section describes Astaroth, the great Duke of Hell, appears as an angel corrupted, gives true answers about past, present, future. but requires blood sacrifice and proper circle. Warning: if circle is broken during invocation, the summoner becomes the sacrifice instead. Below that, in increasingly frantic handwriting, found these symbols on trees near Millstone Trail. They match the sigils exactly. Someone is actually attempting this. Not just one demon, multiple sigils, overlapping patterns. This isn't a single summoning, it's something bigger. The lunar calendar, Ryan circled today's date, then drew an arrow to a note. Dark moon in October, traditionally most powerful time for necromantic work and demonic invocation. Veil between worlds at thinnest. David's hands trembled as he flipped through more pages. The book was a photocopy of something much older, the original text clearly from centuries ago. But someone had added modern annotations in the margins, updates in different handwriting spanning what looked like decades. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago, in flowing script that made David's eyes hurt to focus on. The 12 are assembled, the signs are aligned. 3 centuries we have waited, and now the door will finally open. What was bound will be freed, what was banished will return. The new age begins with the sacrifice of the innocent fool who stumbled into our sacred ground. Ryan. They were talking about Ryan. David grabbed the notebook, stuffed it into his pack, and headed back outside. The trail Ryan had mentioned, the one not on the official maps, had to start somewhere near here. He swept his flashlight beam across the tree line until he spotted it. A gap in the undergrowth, barely visible, marked by a small cairn of stones that looked far older than the park's establishment. He hesitated at the threshold. Everything in his limited experience told him this was suicide. He should drive back, call the state police, wait for people who actually knew what they were doing. He was 3 months into this job. He'd never handled a real emergency. He'd never even seen a dead body outside of his grandfather's open casket funeral. But Ryan's voice whispered through his memory, "Don't come looking for me." Why would he say that unless he knew David would? Unless he knew David was the only chance? David took a breath, checked his weapon one more time, and entered the forest. The trail was overgrown but still discernible, marked every 100 yards or so by those same stone cairns. His flashlight beam danced across tree trunks, and within minutes he saw what Ryan had described, symbols carved deep into the bark, far too precise and deliberate to be random. The first was a circle with a 7-pointed star inside, and around the circumference, words in a language he couldn't read. The second tree bore a different symbol, this one more complex, a geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly, as though the angles themselves were wrong. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in David's place? The temperature dropped as he moved deeper into the forest, his breath misting in the air. This wasn't normal October cold. This was the cold of caves, of cellars, of places where warmth had never reached. His flashlight began to flicker, and he slapped it against his palm, but the effect only worsened. The beam turned yellowish, weak, as though something in the air itself was absorbing the light. Then he heard the chanting. It came from ahead, multiple voices speaking in unison, the words rising and falling in a rhythm that made his stomach churn. David killed his flashlight and moved forward by moonlight alone. Except there was no moon tonight, he realized. Dark moon. That's what Ryan's notes had said. The sky above was starless, cloud-covered, yet somehow there was enough illumination to navigate by. A sickly greenish phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the moss on the trees themselves. The trail widened into a clearing, and David dropped to a crouch behind a fallen log, his heart hammering so hard he feared it would give him away. The scene before him was impossible, something from medieval woodcuts or fever dreams. 12 figures in deep crimson robes stood in a perfect circle around a flat stone altar. The stone was covered in symbols identical to those he'd seen carved into the trees, but these were painted in what looked horribly like blood, still wet and gleaming in the strange light. Candles surrounded the circle, black wax dripping into patterns that suggested their own deliberate design, and in the center, tied to the altar, was Ryan. He was still alive. David could see his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. His ranger uniform had been cut away, exposing his torso, and across his chest someone had painted more symbols in that same dark substance. His eyes were wide, darting frantically between the robed figures, and David could see his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been begging. The figure at the head of the circle, the woman Ryan had described, was speaking now, her voice carrying clearly through the cold air. She'd pulled back her hood, and David understood immediately what Ryan had meant about her eyes. They were completely black from edge to edge, as though someone had replaced her eyeballs with polished obsidian. Her skin was too pale, almost luminescent, and when she spoke, David could see that Ryan had been right about her teeth as well. Too many, too sharp, not quite fitting together the way human teeth should. Astaroth, Asmodeus, Belith, Person, Marax, Ipos, Aim, Naberius, Glaziolabolus, Buer, Gusion, Citri. She called out the names, and after each one, the other 11 figures responded in unison with a phrase in that same ancient language. Latin, David thought, or something that sounded like Latin twisted into new shapes. The woman raised her arms, and David saw she held something in each hand. In her right, a knife with a blade that seemed to drink the light around it. In her left, a book bound in what looked sickeningly like human skin, pages yellowed with age. 300 years ago, she said, and her voice was wrong too, layered, as though multiple people spoke through her throat simultaneously. Our predecessors attempted this working. They sought to tear down the veil, to bring forth the court of the 72, to remake this world in the image of true power. They failed. The ritual was interrupted. The leaders were burned as witches, and their grimoire was thought destroyed. She held up the book triumphantly. But it survived, passed down through our bloodlines, waiting for this moment. Tonight, under the dark moon, with the proper sacrifice prepared, we will succeed where they failed. The boundary will shatter. The court will walk this earth again, and we, their faithful servants, will be rewarded beyond mortal comprehension. The other figures began to chant faster, their voices rising in pitch and intensity. The candles flared brighter, their flames turning from orange to blue to a sickly purple. The symbols painted on the stone altar began to glow with the same color, and David realized with mounting horror that the light was coming from beneath the stone, as though something was already pushing its way up from whatever depths lay below. He had to do something. Now. But what? He was one person with a service pistol against 12 cultists performing what was apparently an actual demonic summoning. The rational part of his mind still insisted this had to be some elaborate hoax, some theater, but the primitive, ancient part of his brain, the part that still remembered when humans huddled in caves and feared the dark, screamed that every bit of this was terribly, impossibly real. The woman stepped forward, raising the knife above Ryan's chest. With blood we open the door. With flesh we greet our masters. With bone we seal the covenant. The offering is prepared. The words have been spoken. Now, let the veil be. David stood up and fired his weapon into the air. The gunshot shattered the night, echoing through the forest like thunder. The chanting stopped abruptly. All 12 figures turned to face him, their movements synchronized in a way that made his skin crawl. "Federal officer!" David's voice cracked, betraying his terror, but he pushed forward anyway. "Step away from him! All of you, hands where I can see them! This gathering is illegal, and you're all under arrest for kidnapping and—" The woman laughed, and the sound was so alien, so fundamentally wrong that David nearly dropped his weapon. It wasn't mirth. It was the sound of something that had watched humans for eons and found them endlessly amusing in their futility. "A child with a toy," she said, and her voice wrapped around David's mind like cold fingers. "Come to stop powers you cannot comprehend. How perfectly fitting. How wonderfully predictable." She gestured, and 2 of the robed figures broke from the circle, moving toward David with movements that were too smooth, too fluid, almost gliding across the uneven ground. David aimed his weapon at them. "Stay back. I will shoot." "Will you?" The woman tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far, vertebrae that bent in ways human necks shouldn't. "And what will that accomplish? You'll put holes in borrowed flesh, yes. But do you truly believe these vessels are what you're facing? The two figures reached up and pulled back their hoods, and David's blood turned to ice. Their faces were slack, eyes glazed and vacant, mouths hanging open to reveal blackened tongues. They moved like puppets, like corpses animated by something else entirely. They offered themselves willingly, the woman continued, gave up their souls for the promise of power in the new age. Now they are merely containers, empty husks awaiting new occupants once the door opens. David fired. The bullet struck the nearest figure square in the chest, and it staggered backward but didn't fall. No blood. No cry of pain. It simply steadied itself and continued forward, a dark stain spreading across its robe, but no other sign it had even noticed the wound. "Oh, rookie." Ryan's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it cut through David's rising panic. "Told you not to come." David fired again and again, backing away as the two figures continued their inexorable advance. His training had never covered this. Nothing had prepared him for enemies that didn't react to bullets, for situations where the rules of reality itself seemed to have been suspended. The woman turned back to Ryan, raising the knife once more. "Enough distraction. The hour grows late, and the working must be completed before dawn, or we wait another generation. Your friend's interruption changes nothing. He'll simply be an additional offering once we've finished with you." "No." David rushed forward, abandoning any pretense of maintaining distance. One of the robed figures grabbed his arm, and the touch was cold, so cold it burned, like plunging his hand into liquid nitrogen. David screamed and twisted away, leaving skin behind on the thing's fingers. He stumbled into the circle, breaking the line of candles. The woman shrieked, a sound of pure rage that made his ears ring. And suddenly all 12 figures converged on him. "Fool, you've broken the circle." The invocation was incomplete, the boundaries unsecured. The woman's perfect composure shattered, her voice rising to a screech that echoed with inhuman harmonics. "The door opens now without control, without bindings. You've damned us all." The ground beneath the altar split with a sound like the earth itself screaming. Purple light poured from the crack, and with it came a smell that made David gag. Rot and sulfur, and something underneath that was worse. Something that suggested vast age and cosmic indifference. The symbols on the altar stone flared so bright David had to shield his eyes, and when he looked again, Ryan was sitting up, the ropes that had bound him falling away like burned spider silk. But Ryan's eyes were wrong now too. Black from edge to edge, just like the woman's. "Oh," Ryan said in a voice that definitely wasn't his own, multi-layered and ancient. "Oh, how long it has been since we walked this earth in flesh." The woman fell to her knees, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious terror. "Lord Astaroth, we meant no disrespect. We were attempting to summon you properly with the full ritual of binding and..." "Binding?" Ryan's head swiveled toward her, the movement bird-like, predatory. "You sought to bind us? To leash the court like dogs for your petty purposes? How dare you? How dare you?" Ryan's mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, and from within came a sound that wasn't a voice, but a vibration, something that resonated in David's bones and made his vision swim with impossible colors. The woman's scream was cut short as her body simply came apart, dissolving into ash that scattered on a wind that came from nowhere. The other 11 robed figures tried to run, but they made it only a few steps before they too crumbled, their empty husks no longer useful to whatever had animated them. David couldn't move. He stood frozen as Ryan, the thing wearing Ryan, climbed down from the altar and approached him. Behind it, the crack in the earth widened, and David could see shapes moving in the purple light below. Too many of them, vast and terrible and hungry. "You," the thing said, stopping inches from David's face, the untrained child who broke the circle. "You've given us such a gift, an opening without constraints, without bindings. Your world will be a feast." David found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Ryan, if you're still in there, fight it." Something flickered in those black eyes, a moment of conflict, of struggle. The thing wearing Ryan's face grimaced, and for just a second, David heard his friend's real voice. "Run, David. For God's sake, run." Then the eyes went black again and the thing smiled with too many teeth, but David had heard enough. His friend was still fighting, still trying to resist whatever had taken him, which meant there might still be a chance. David pulled out the notebook he'd taken from the station and flipped frantically through the pages. There had to be something, some protection, some way to fight back. His grandmother's warnings echoed in his memory. She'd made him memorize prayers, told him specific words to say if he ever encountered true evil. His eyes landed on a passage Ryan had copied. To banish summoned entities, the operator must speak the words of dismissal from the grimoire itself, but only if spoken in the original tongue, with proper intonation, within the consecrated circle. If the circle is broken, no mortal banishment is possible. Only the caster's death can sever the connection. David looked up at Ryan's possessed form, then at the widening crack in the earth, then back at the notebook. The caster's death. The woman had been leading the ritual. She was already dead. But the ritual required blood, and Ryan's blood had been used. Ryan was both the sacrifice and, in a terrible way, the caster. His blood had opened the door. His blood had to close it. David's hands shook as realization crashed over him. There was only one way to stop this. One way to seal the door before whatever was climbing up from below could fully emerge into the world. He looked at his friend, at the thing wearing his face, and raised his weapon. "I'm sorry," David whispered. "I'm so sorry, Ryan." The thing smiled wider. "Empty threats. You won't shoot. Your moral weakness." David fired. Once, twice, 3 times. Center mass, just like they'd taught him in training. The thing wearing Ryan staggered backward, genuine surprise flashing across its stolen features. Dark blood, too dark, almost black, poured from the wounds. "No," it gasped, and David heard both voices now, the demon's and Ryan's, speaking in horrible harmony. "No, the ritual. Incomplete. The door." Ryan's body collapsed onto the altar, and the moment his blood touched the stone, the symbols flared one final time. The crack in the earth began to close, purple light dimming, the shapes below shrieking in rage as they were pulled back down into whatever depths they'd emerged from. The thing's last words were in Ryan's voice, clear and human. "Thank you. You did good, rookie." Then silence. The clearing was dark again, lit only by the dying embers of overturned candles. The bodies of the cultists were nothing but ash now, scattered across the ground. The altar was just a stone again. The symbols faded to barely visible stains. And Ryan, his friend, his fellow rookie, the guy who'd promised they'd both make it through their first year and laugh about how scared they'd been, lay dead on the altar, his blood sealing the door he'd unknowingly helped open. David sank to his knees, his weapon falling from numb fingers. He'd done it. He'd stopped the ritual, closed the door, saved the world from something terrible beyond comprehension. He'd also killed his friend. The radio on his belt crackled to life, normal static this time, no supernatural undertones. Martinez's voice came through, scratchy but blessedly ordinary. "David, you there? Sorry for the late response. Had a medical emergency at the main station. What's your status?" David stared at the radio for a long moment, then at the scene around him. How could he possibly explain this? Who would believe him? He looked like a rookie who'd had a psychotic break and murdered both his fellow ranger and 12 civilians in some sort of paranoid episode. But when he looked around the clearing again, something had changed. The robed bodies were gone, not turned to ash, but simply gone, as though they'd never been there. The altar was just an old stone covered in what might have been lichen or old moss. The symbols on the trees, when he checked them with his flashlight, were just natural patterns in the bark, nothing more. Only Ryan remained, his body exactly where it had fallen, gunshot wounds clearly visible. David picked up his radio with shaking hands. "Martinez, I need you to send everyone. Everything. There's been an incident. Ryan's dead. I had to..." His voice broke. and he couldn't continue. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever impossible things he'd witnessed, they'd leave no evidence behind. The world would see only a tragic mistake. A rookie ranger who'd panicked and shot his friend in the dark woods, probably mistaking him for a threat. David looked down at his hands, still trembling, and realized that was exactly what the world needed to see. Because the alternative, the truth that demonic forces were real, that people gathered in forests to summon ancient evils, that the boundaries between worlds were thin and growing thinner, that truth would shatter everything people believed about reality. Sometimes the lies we tell are more merciful than the truth. As sirens began to wail in the distance, David sat beside his friend's body and began to cry, mourning not just for Ryan but for his own innocence, for the simple world he'd lived in just hours ago, before the desperate call that had changed everything. He'd survived his first real emergency as a park ranger, but the man who would emerge from Blackwood National Forest that night would be fundamentally different from the uncertain rookie who'd entered it. David had looked into the abyss, had seen the thin veil between the safe, ordered world and the chaos that lurked just beneath. And he knew, with cold certainty, that what happened tonight was just a beginning. The woman had said they'd waited 300 years. That meant there were others, other groups, other attempts to tear down the veil. The grimoire Ryan had been studying was only a photocopy, which meant the original was still out there somewhere. The Court of the 72, whatever they truly were, remained on the other side of that door, patient and eternal, waiting for another chance. As they loaded Ryan's body into the medical examiner's vehicle, as they took David's weapon for evidence, as Martinez put a blanket around his shoulders and guided him toward a police car, David caught movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure in the trees, watching. Just for a moment, before melting back into shadow. But in that moment, David saw its eyes, black from edge to edge. They were still here. They were always here, waiting. And David, the unprepared rookie who'd stumbled into their world, was the only one who knew. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?